afternoon. And first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child benefit. Would members wishing to speak in this debate please press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and move the motion. Deputy First Minister, 14 minutes please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I very much welcome this opportunity for the Parliament to debate recent changes to child benefit and the impact that these changes, together with wider welfare and benefit changes, will have on women, children and families right across Scotland. And at the outset of this debate, let me say that I very much hope that whatever else we might disagree on in this chamber, we will all be able to agree that it is simply unacceptable. Indeed, I would describe it as morally unacceptable that almost 1 in 5 children in our rich country live in poverty, and that those in the poorest 3 income deciles share just 14% of our collective income. I think it is incumbent on all of us, this government and everybody in this Parliament, to address this to the very best of our ability. And on behalf of the government, I accept unreservedly the responsibility we have in that regard. Tackling these levels of poverty and inequality is a central priority for the Scottish Government, and as I've just said, it should be a driving priority for all of us in Scotland. Indeed, it is perhaps above all else my desire to see greater equality, greater fairness and greater social justice that will lead me next year, when faced with what I have to say is an excellent question, should Scotland be an independent country, to vote yes. Under Westminster Government, we are part of the 4th most unequal society in the developed world. I don't believe we should settle for that. That is not as good as it gets. I believe Scotland can and should do better, and it is that very passionate belief that drives my support for Scotland being an independent country. I believe it not just because greater equality will enhance the quality of life for individuals in Scotland, although it will undoubtedly do that. I believe it also because a wealth of international evidence shows that countries that achieve greater social equality and social justice also perform better in economic terms. Social justice leads to social cohesion, and that is the building block of economic success. And that is why, as a government, our economic strategy and our national performance framework include cohesion and solidarity targets designed to increase incomes and to reduce the disparity between different sections of our society. But while we pursue this approach in Scotland, and we will continue to do so, the UK Government, as we all know, is implementing far-reaching changes and significant spending reductions right across the welfare system. The package of welfare cuts being introduced by the UK Government will, I believe, have a significant impact on some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Health, housing, social care, employability, all of these services, devolved services, will be affected in some way. And what we have is a situation where reserved decisions that we have no say over, impacting on devolved areas of responsibility, highlighting, in my view, the inadequacy of our current system of government. The scope and the scale of these changes presents really significant challenges for people and for organisations in Scotland, and threaten to undermine and indeed cancel out so much of the good work that we collectively are able to do here in Scotland. That's true of the removal of disability living allowance, it's true of the reductions in working tax credits, and what I would describe as the scandalous imposition of the bedroom tax that will see over 100,000 tenants of socially rented property lose an average of £12 every week from under-occupancy restrictions. And, Presiding Officer, it is also true of the child benefit changes that have been introduced recently by the UK Government. These newly implemented child benefit changes will see around 90,000 families in Scotland having their child benefit income reduced or removed. Now, the UK Government says that doesn't matter because it only affects the better off, except that their cack-handed implementation means that many people losing benefit will actually be on lower incomes than some of those people retaining the benefit. But with child benefit, there is, in my view, a more fundamental point at stake, a fundamental point of principle. We've had much debate in this chamber recently about universal benefits, I believe that universal provision of key benefits is part of the social wage, and I'll say more about that later. Others, I accept, disagree with that view. Some, like the Conservatives, have probably always disagreed. Others, like Labour, have more recently come to betray the principle of universality. But until recently, one thing that I thought we all agreed on was that of all benefits, the one that should be, in my view, without doubt universal, was child benefit. You know, child benefit is a benefit paid in many, the majority probably of cases, directly to women, and therefore more likely than so many other forms of support to directly benefit children and families. And I believe that it is fundamentally wrong that it is now subject to a means test. But yes.
Elizabeth Smith.
While we obviously come from very different policy perspectives, I don't disagree with some of the analysis that the Deputy First Minister has made. When you outline your policies for an independent Scotland, are you saying that there will be a commitment to reinstate universal child benefit?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, we'll outline our policies for welfare in an independent Scotland, and we'll do that in order to persuade people of the benefits of independent. And can I say that our commitment to universal provision of key benefits will be a key part of those policies, and it will also be our aim over time when we have our hands on the levers of power in an independent Scotland to ensure that we build a welfare system that reflects our values as a society. And that is one, in my view, of the key overriding arguments for this Parliament being independent and being in charge of welfare. But, Presiding Officer, the cuts to child benefit do go further than just the introduction of a means test. At the same time as the benefit has been removed or reduced for 90,000 families, for others it's been subject to a 3-year freeze followed by the 1% uprating cap, meaning that a family with 2 children will be £1,100 worse off. We have to recognise that when we're talking about these amounts of money, we're talking about a direct impact on the well-being of children across Scotland. The DWP themselves have estimated that their latest changes to benefit uprating, which take effect between this year and 2016, will result in an extra 200,000 children across the UK being in relative income poverty compared to the current method of uprating benefits by the Consumer Price Index. And based on the current share of children in poverty, that will result in an estimated 15,000 children in Scotland being pushed into poverty as a result of the UK Government's misguided policies. 15,000 Scottish children plunged into poverty as a result of policies we don't support, introduced by a government Scotland did not vote for. It is beyond me how anyone who cares about democracy and social justice, and I include those in other parties because I know we all care about democracy and social justice, but it is beyond me how anybody who does so can argue against welfare powers being in the hands of this Parliament so that we can ensure that we have a welfare system that reflects what we want it to reflect. And of course the situation is, yes.
Deputy First Minister rightly talks about the 200,000 children who would be at risk of falling back into poverty across the UK and pinpoints the 15,000 children in Scotland. For the 185,000 children across the UK who are not in Scotland, how does her solution help them?
I don't want to see a single child anywhere in the UK or anywhere in the world living in poverty. But as a Scottish minister, I have a primary responsibility to ensure that we are doing everything we can in Scotland to lift Scottish children out of poverty. And it infuriates me when we have a situation where the policies of a government that Scotland did not vote for, a government that his party does not support, introduces policies that run counter to our attempts to tackle child poverty. And frankly, I don't think that excuse is good enough for us simply to wring our hands and say we accept a situation where 15,000 more Scottish children get plunged into poverty. This government will never accept such a situation. And the situation is of even greater concern when we consider the Resolution Foundation's estimate that 60% of the cuts resulting from the 1% cap on the uprating of benefits would fall on in-work households, giving lie to the UK Government's claim that the reforms are all about the so-called work-shy. In fact, yes,
Alec Johnson.
These not the same in-work households that have benefited from a massive rise in the tax threshold, which will result in a typical earner getting £2,500 more in income as a result of tax threshold changes.
Well, even if that was correct, where is the logic in, according to Alec Johnson's analysis, giving with one hand just to take away with the other hand? The point is to try to lift people out of poverty, not to push them straight back into it. The changes that we are debating here today, the totality of the welfare changes and the operating to benefit changes will affect 1 million working age households in Scotland. And we estimate that they will reduce the total income of Scottish households by around £210 million by 14-15. Again, providing a brake on an economy that we should be trying to get going. And when we think about those households with children who are living in poverty, where benefits make up over half of their income, that situation, frankly, is of serious concern. Different projections, but one thing clear and central to this: these changes will have a significant negative impact on child poverty in Scotland. Now, mitigation of all this is beyond the powers of this government. Responsibility does lie with the UK government, and we will continue to press them to do more. But we will continue to do what we can, where we can, to protect the most vulnerable in our society. Just last week, I announced the package of more than £5 million to support organisations on the front line delivering advice and assistance. These organisations are under pressure as more people come to them for help. This money will help provide much needed support to individuals and families. We're also providing... Yes, briefly.
Could I ask why she delayed that package that she recognises as being so important by 18 months when the consequentials were already given to the Scottish Government?
Deputy First Minister.
I wonder what side of this Jackie Baillie is on. Why can't she join with Citizens Advice Scotland and welcome this announcement? This is help we are giving, instead of appearing sometimes to be defending the UK government that she supposedly doesn't support. We're also providing more than £9 million for the new Scottish Welfare Fund to top up the funding to be transferred from the Department for Work and Pensions. Again, hopefully something Labour will be able to support. We will do everything we can to mitigate, but wouldn't it be so much better, infinitely better, for this Parliament not to have to spend valuable resources mitigating the wrong-headed policies of a Tory government in Westminster, and instead be able to design a welfare system we want and invest these resources in lifting people out of poverty? That is what we need to aspire to do. As I said earlier, the changes to child benefit are not just about impact. Important and devastating though that impact might be, it is about a matter of principle. The removal of entitlements is, in my view, at odds with the principle of universal benefits and the benefits that I believe it can deliver for all. The social wage we have protected over the past number of years is part of the contract between the people of Scotland and their government, and under it we will defend core universal services, rights and benefits. We've introduced and maintained free university education, prescriptions, personal care for the elderly, and provided that guarantee of no compulsory redundancies that the First Minister was talking about here before lunchtime. These are the right policies, and I believe that it would be so much better in this Parliament if we had all of the powers, so that we didn't have a situation where policies introduced elsewhere run counter to the work we seek to do here in this Parliament. If I've got time,
yes.
Officer? Briefly.
Since the Cabinet Secretary uses the term universal benefits to cover the devolved universal services, is she saying in the last two lines of her motion that it would be impossible post-independence for a devolved SNP government to protect what she calls universal benefits?
Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry, post-independence there won't be a devolved SNP government. I hope there'll be a SNP government of an independent Scottish Parliament. But what I do say is a consequence of people in Scotland voting no next year is we continue to be at the mercy of Tory governments who cut our budgets and cut welfare for the most vulnerable in our society. And I have the greatest respect for Malcolm Chisholm, which is why I can't believe that deep down inside he is happy with that prospect, because I know he wants better for Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, it doesn't give me pleasure actually to move this motion. I wish we weren't having to debate this afternoon, because I wish we did have the powers that we need to make sure we have the welfare system that suits our people, and hopefully before too much longer that is exactly what we will have. I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. Now call on Drew Smith to speak to and move Amendment 5521.1. 10 minutes, please, Mr Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Family allowance was introduced in 1946 by the great reforming Labour government, which did so much to create and extend the welfare state, and it was replaced by child benefit by another Labour government in 1975. The last Labour government augmented support for children through a system of tax credits. Child benefit has, until this month, been paid on a universal basis, recognising that as a society we all have a responsibility towards all of the nation's children. Universal provision has also had the effect of tying middle and higher income families into a system of support, which is provided to all. It has also meant that the administration of that system has been easier, and there is less of a danger of those most in need failing to claim. Child benefit, as the Deputy First Minister rightly said, has historically been a benefit paid directly to women for the purposes of supporting children. So in terms of the overall architecture of our welfare state, it has always been a crucially important component of the welfare system. The decision of the UK coalition parties to attack child benefit has been condemned by my party elsewhere, and I'm happy to repeat that Scottish Labour regards the changes which have been made to be the wrong approach. One of the tests which should be applied to any universal provision is whether application to all makes it easier to reach those most in need, and whether the cost of means testing is proportionate or not. On this side, we recognise that there is a need to ensure that money is spent wisely, and indeed we have also always argued that most support should go to those most in need. However, it is regrettable that the reform of child benefit, and indeed the callous cap on benefit uprating, has resulted in an attack directly upon children and cruelty towards the vulnerable who have been labelled skivers by the Tories and Liberal Democrats. The unfairnesses of this are manifest when they are viewed in the round, and particularly against the tax cuts for millionaires. That said, we are also on this side wary of the promises of parties who have never had to administer a welfare system promising the earth, or as Mark MacDonald described it last week, the moon on a stick, if only people are persuaded to vote for our constitutional proposition. A proposition which has always been the nationalist solution to every problem, since time immemorial, and which can no way be described as an argument for the times. I'm happy to take the Deputy First Minister if she was seeking to make an intervention.
Well, I'm just saying, he's criticising the solution of the Scottish Government, and just for the record, I do believe independence offers the solutions to many of these problems, but is it the case that he's simply in a position of having no solution? Because as long as we've got Tory governments that Scotland doesn't vote for, we simply have to put up with these things.
Well,
Drew Smith.
The Labour at Westminster, in terms of the upratings bill, put forward a very clear proposal that the UK Government could have followed. 1.2 million families across Britain will lose out on child benefit because of these changes. According to the IFS, 7 million working households will lose an average of £165 a year because of the upratings cap. Not including cuts to child benefits, new mothers will lose £1,300 during pregnancy and in the first year of their child's life because of the combination of cuts to maternity pay, pregnancy support and tax credits. The result of the coalition's changes is also administrative chaos. Richer families will continue to be able to claim child benefit, meaning the state must pay money out and then attempt to claw it back, up to the total amount paid in the first place. One result of this is that it is likely that many more people will find themselves drawn into self-assessment tax for the first time. The Deputy First Minister's motion rightly makes reference to both benefit uprating and child benefit eligibility, and I actually agree with much of what she said about both. The coalition parties have sought to turn benefit uprating into a political football, and this is regrettable. Their description of strivers and skivers is a simplistic and frankly offensive, so far as those labelled as the latter is concerned. Many of those affected by the uprating cap are, of course, in work, including many whose only benefit might up to now have been child benefit. For those that are out of work, there are a whole range of reasons for this. The first that has to be said is a lack of jobs due to the mismanagement of our economy and the stalling of the recovery. Presiding Officer, I now want to turn to the part of the Scottish Government's motion which I find slightly less persuasive than the first. The Scottish Government asserts that the only way to protect universal benefits which provide fair and equitable outcomes is to support separation of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. There are a number of problems with this assertion, and I fear that members will be well used to spotting them. Firstly, universal benefits on their own do not necessarily produce fair and equitable outcomes. If the SNP were genuinely interested in a debate on this issue and on the issue of universality, rather than trying to score political points against Scottish Labour, then they would find it in themselves to acknowledge, as their policies in other areas actually do, in a moment, Mr Stewart, as their policies in other areas actually do, that fair and equitable outcomes are achieved through a combination of interventions, which must include targeting of the most support at those most in need of help. In any other time and in any other place, that wouldn't be considered controversial, presiding officer. But to the SNP now, it is apparently heresy. I'm happy to take Mr Eadie. I apologise, Mr Stewart.
Jim Eadie. I call Jim Eadie.
If Mr Stewart will just wait his turn, I'm sure he'll have a chance to make an excellent contribution. Grateful to the member for giving way, but when he makes the point about targeting, does he not understand the point that is made by advocacy organisations that when you have benefits that are means tested, you actually cut out many people who are vulnerable and in need, who do not have the literacy skills or the advocacy skills to navigate their way through the benefit system. And what we really need is an integration of tax and benefits to help the most vulnerable in our society.
Well, the problem, Mr Eadie, is that there is a balance between universalism and targeting. As members of the SNP will rightly know, having voted for the bill that they voted for on legal aid just this week, or on the changes that they have made to the heating programme. Secondly, of course, the SNP present us with a solution which does absolutely nothing for those who lose out because of the UK Government's changes, but happen to live south of Gretna or west of Stranraer. No thank you, Mr MacDonald. I'm not particularly interested in a debate about the deserving and undeserving poor, but if there are choices to be made, I would hope, at least, that we might be able to make them on the basis of material considerations, such as whether or not you can afford new shoes for your kid or a meal for a school friend staying over, rather than geography and national identity. Sure.
Mark MacDonald.
I also care about child poverty in Mexico, for example. Is it Drew's miscontention that I can only care about that if we're in a political union with Mexico?
The point, Mr MacDonald, is that we currently pay into a pot for UK welfare, and the SNP are seeking to withdraw our money from that pot. The SNP now like to pretend that their nationalism is suddenly all about social justice and not about nationality at all. However, it is on welfare issues that their argument becomes most contorted. People across Britain pay into our welfare state. Removing our money from the pot is not progressive. It is as selfish as claiming to the poorest that their problems will all be solved if only the SNP win a vote is dishonest. Presiding officer, having dealt with the part of the Cabinet Secretary's motion which I agree with and the part about which I remain to be convinced, I want to turn to Labour's amendment. Last week, an important report was published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and I want to quote some words from the author. With the political debate dominated by the referendum on independence, it is important to point out that issues that are central to tackling poverty, such as health, childcare, schools and housing, fall within current legislative powers of the Scottish Government. The problems highlighted in this report cannot wait. Action can and should be taken now. So I listened carefully to the Deputy First Minister when she responded to that report in Glasgow on Monday. I've listened to what she has said since. I listened to the First Minister when I asked him a question about that report last Thursday, and I read more yesterday about what he had to say on these issues when he spoke to the Jimmy Reid Foundation on Tuesday. But nowhere in any of these statements did I hear an answer to the central question posed by the JRF. Does the Scottish Government accept that it could do more with the powers it already has, and when will it go beyond trying to respond to statistics on child poverty and on poverty across society, which span its term of office, by highlighting the future likelihood that new and coming welfare reforms are unwelcome? Let me quote that JRF again. It is important to point out that the issues that are central to tackling poverty, health, childcare, schools and housing, fall within the current powers of the Government. I put the words in my amendment as well, in case there is any danger that the Scottish Government have missed them. Presiding officer, in the whole time we have been discussing welfare reform in this Parliament, my party and the Deputy First Ministers have been fairly well united in our analysis, our concerns and our ambition for us to do all that we can to mitigate where we can. The Scottish Government, though, must go beyond blaming others and using the poor as a superficially convenient argument for the more powers that they have always wanted. If child benefit was going up and school milk could be laced with honey, the SNP would still want the breakup of the UK welfare state. On welfare reform, we have already welcomed plans to plug the gap in council tax benefit, half funded by councils, but we still have no idea how long this will be provided for. On passported benefits, we are still no clearer about how long-term eligibility will work. So let me make a serious request to the Deputy First Minister on... I do apologise, Mr Stewart. I would have liked to, but I'm afraid I don't have time. So let me make a serious request here on jobs and training, on childcare, on tackling health inequalities and support for vulnerable 2-year-olds, which they promised, on extra time for GPs and the deep end practices that they're asking for, on addiction services for parents, on supporting local councils and communities which are being affected by welfare change. Why can't we debate those issues with the Scottish Government? Why can't we debate the opportunity provided by devolution to do more to help children in poverty? These issues and many more should be our concerns. I was elected to this Parliament in 2011, and the time I've been here we've debated many issues, some worthy, but few as significant as this. Yet the only times that we've discussed poverty in Scotland has been in a few debates about the actions of the UK Government. Presiding Officer, I would suggest that when the JRF tells you that your past actions are failing, that a young boy in the city that the Deputy First Minister and I both represent is likely to die 14 years younger than if he is born poor rather than rich, then I think debating what you don't have power over and avoiding scrutiny about what you do is a response which is wholly inadequate, and I therefore move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Now call on Alec Johnston to speak to and move Amendment 5521.3. Mr Johnston, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It always gives me great pleasure to come in and take my seat in the grandstand to watch the SNP perform on their current format. And also it improves that position when the prima donna role is taken by Nicola Sturgeon herself. The truth is that the aims and objectives of welfare reform are well identified and need to be defended in this chamber. These aims are to reform and rationalise the benefit system away from the ad hoc structure that has grown up over the past 60 years, and to remove entrenched benefit dependency, which, beside the economic impact on both state and individual, actively harms the individual in terms of health, ambition, aspiration and social exclusion. Areas in which the long-term benefits dependency is seen as an option tend to have high levels of debt, family breakdown, alcohol, drug addiction and crime rates. It is therefore essential that we recognise the need for welfare reform and that we must all participate in that process. It also is important to ensure, no thank you, you can push your button and I'm sure you'll get the chance later on, but it's also essential that we make sure that in future work pays and that when people can work, they will financially benefit from doing so. Now, I have to take the opportunity today to attack the government for what I see as a degree of dishonesty. I believe that they see the need for welfare reform, and that while they condemn the UK government for doing it, Nicola Sturgeon, quite rightly, is delighted that they are doing that job for her before, heaven forbid, she finds herself with her hands on the reins of power. However, this will not happen, and the reason why it will not happen is that the people of Scotland have already seen through that shallow position. So far, this government have used their politically motivated synthetic outrage to whip up panic among benefits claimants. Now realising that this has only alienated the hard-working families who pay the tax which fund the benefits, we have today seen the government decide to go for the hearts and minds of the middle classes who benefit most from child support. It is disingenuous to take that line, because for all our hand-wringing, not a penny appears to be coming to the table. There are being promises made, yet no explanation about how they will be funded. Now, going back to the original debate on the legislative consent motion, figures were brought to this chamber which said that came from the government's backbenches, in fact, which said that the welfare reforms would cost the Scottish economy £600 million and put 14,000 jobs at risk. Now, that seems a huge amount of money and a lot of jobs. However, it also betrays the bizarre assumption that the purpose of paying benefits is to provide economic activity. It completely misses the point that benefits can be paid only out of the money that comes directly from the taxpayers and is therefore already being drawn out of the economy in the first place. Alternatively, you could choose to borrow it, and the explanation as to how a Scottish Government intends to ultimately pay back that borrowing, other than through increased taxation, is one that I, unfortunately, cannot understand. I believe that the pressure is on the Government today to be honest about how it will achieve the objectives to which it vaguely refers on a regular basis. That's why, in the closing speech, I hope to hear from this Government exactly how they will finance these proposals. I want to hear, for the first time, costed commitments to how they will achieve the reversal of these welfare reforms. I want to hear costed estimates of how these vague promises to restore universal benefit will be funded. If she can't do that, then at least will she, as Liz Smith mentioned earlier, commit to reinstate child benefit, on which this debate is centred today. I therefore call on the Scottish Government to put an end to this cynical manipulation and rhetoric and actually bring something material to the discussion. Before I get to a close, I'd like to address the amendments that have been brought forward to this debate. And I can assure all members in the chamber that while it's impossible for the Conservatives to support the motion itself, that all the amendments do meet with our approval. I'd like to deal with the Labour amendment specifically and bring forward one line. Within the Labour amendment, it says quite clearly that it's important to point out that the issues that are central to tackling poverty, such as health, childcare, schools and housing, fall within the current legislative powers of the Scottish Government. It therefore falls to the Scottish Government to explain why their argument says almost exactly the opposite. It also has to be said, as I have tried to point out myself, that, as it says in the Liberal Democrat amendment, that statements have been made by the Scottish Government ministers and supporters implying that a full £2.5 billion will be added to the welfare benefits bill of Scotland after independence. If that is in fact the cost, will the Minister tell us that that is the cost? And if it is, will she tell her where in a future Scottish budget that money is likely to be found? Because, as I said, it must come either from the taxpayer or it must come from borrowing, which will have to be paid by greater taxes in the future. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move Amendment 5521.2. Mr Rennie, 6 minutes, please.
We know what the SNP members don't like. They take every opportunity to focus on the ills of the Westminster Government. They take up copious amount of parliamentary time, not focusing on their responsibilities, their government's responsibilities, but on another government's responsibilities and their duties. Almost from a lofty position, they like to complain, commentate, but they rarely provide solutions, which I think everybody would admit is a tough task. So the purpose of our amendment today is to allow SNP members to set out what they would like the Scottish welfare state to look like. They can tell us which benefits will be cut, which benefits will be increased, and which ones will remain unchanged. They can also tell us whether they will add £2.5 billion to the inherited welfare budget for an independent Scotland. Now, not just now. From their rhetoric, from ministers, and I've got numerous quotes here, I assume that the full £2.5 billion will be restored immediately. So this debate is also timely, I would say, because of the SNP's Welfare Commission, launched earlier this month, apparently will report within the next couple of months. And I'm sure members of that commission would welcome contributions from the SNP benches about whether benefits will be cut which ones will be prioritised and which ones will be deprioritised, because they would welcome their deliberations to feed in, I'm sure, to their conclusions, but also to the recipients of benefits. They'll want to hear from the SNP, again, what will be the priorities for an independent Scotland's welfare budget. They will want to know that their actions will match the rhetoric. SNP members have also said, on numerous occasions, ministers likewise, that they want reform, they want simplification of the welfare system. But I've not heard one single example of a reform. Now, perhaps ministers today, not just now, I'm sure members will take the opportunity today to tell us, but also because of the SNP's Fiscal Commission. I'm sure they will also welcome contributions from SNP members about how they plan to restore the £2.5 billion to the welfare budget. They've been tasked with bringing a degree of fiscal credibility to the SNP's plans for independence. That credibility will be very important, as it will directly impact on the credit ratings, the cost of borrowing, and therefore the sustainability of the finances in an independent Scotland. And I'm curious as to whether, not just now, whether the Fiscal Commission will be meeting the Welfare Commission to ensure a degree of consistency across the numerous commissions that the SNP set up, because we will want to have a degree of coherence, which has been lacking in previous commissions, one commission saying the other and ministers saying something completely different. Perhaps today that might change, but I'm not quite sure from the Deputy First Minister's contribution whether it will indicate a change. I don't think they are going to tell us which benefits will be prioritised and which ones will be deprioritised. Who will be the winners and who will be the losers? Because from the Deputy First Minister, we didn't hear a single word. I think today the SNP members will seek to prejudge the outcome of the Welfare Commission. They will ignore, like many other advisers in the past that have been recruited by the SNP, they will ignore their conclusions because they've already made up their mind what they don't like, and they don't like to face up to the reality of having to live within your finances. There will be a lack of consistency between the fiscal responsibility and their Welfare Commission. We need to have costed plans, not uncosted rhetoric. So, look, we favour in the Liberal Democrats a strong economy, a fair society, so that everybody gets a chance to get on. That's why we've cut taxes for those on low and middle incomes. That's why we've increased the state pension. And that's why we've also introduced a £1 billion youth contract at the same time, and this is critical, at the same time as restoring the public finances to create the conditions for growth. Now, we've got to be absolutely clear. The welfare state under Labour increased by 40%. 40% in the time that they were in charge, at a time of considerable economic growth. Now, from 10 years before 2010, it went from £132 billion to £192 billion. That is simply not sustainable. I'm in my last minute. But we reject, I have to say, the rhetoric of the skivers and the shrivers. And to Drew Smith, we have never used that terminology. We do not favour that terminology. That is not something that we embrace. What we want is an enabling society that people can get up and get on. And I think members today from the SNP benches should take the opportunity not just to criticise the UK government, but to set out in detail what they plan. If they do not match their actions with the rhetoric, I don't think they deserve to be trusted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now move to open debate. Thank you for doing that as well. We now move to open debate, and I call on Annabel Ewing to be followed by Neil Bibby. We're quite tight for time, so if you could take 6 minutes, including interventions, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased indeed to have been able to be called to participate in this important debate this afternoon on child benefit. And I have to say, when I was reflecting on what I wanted to say this afternoon, the first thing that came into my mind was the old adage, if you live long enough. For who could possibly have contemplated that the current UK government would go where even Mrs Thatcher feared to tread in means testing child benefit, and that such a miserly and fundamentally ill-judged course of action was off the agenda even for the Tories, could surely have been safely assumed from what George Osborne said in his address to the party faithful at the 2009 Tory party conference, and I quote from the current Chancellor, "We will preserve child benefit," he said. "We will preserve child benefit, winter fuel payments and free TV licences," and he went on to say that these benefits, and I quote, "are valued by millions." Well, indeed, they are, Chancellor, if you're listening to the debate this afternoon, for the universality of child benefit has been valued by millions since its introduction in the 1940s. And the abandonment of the universality of child benefit by the Tory Liberal government in London is not just a breach of faith with the people, it is a breach of the social contract that I believe underpins a decent society. And I would have to say to Mr Rennie, shame on, in particular, the Liberal Democrats for doing what even Mrs Thatcher was not prepared to do in terms of means testing of child benefit. And I think it is fair to say that it would certainly have been the case at least some years back that such a policy would never have been associated with the old Liberal Party's values. And, Presiding Officer, I would have to say it's certainly changed days now. The importance of the role of child benefit and its universal payment should not be, I believe, underestimated. And this was a point very well summarised by an earlier report of the House of Commons, then Social Security Committee in 1999. And they recognised the multi-purpose role of child benefit and that its role was inter alia to involve the promotion of horizontal equity between people of similar incomes with and without children. It was also recognised to involve the provision of a contribution from society as a whole to the next generation. And also there was a recognition, crucially, I believe, of the fact that such a benefit, as the Deputy First Minister alluded to, was offered to women. It was paid to women in the household. Well, you weren't very keen on taking interventions, Mr Johnson, but I will do, yes.
I'm going to pose a very simple question. I respect the fact that the member considers child benefit to be right at the top of the list of priorities. But in a difficult time, when budgets are difficult to manage, where would she decide to take that money from in order to make child benefit her first priority?
Annabel Ewing.
Well, my colleagues are shouting Trident, that would be just one to name. Obviously, if Scotland had control over our own resources, we could decide how to spend them in accordance with our priorities. But I would say to Mr Johnson that if he's so keen and confident about being able to defend what really is the indefensible, then why is it that the UK Cabinet Secretary for Welfare, Mr Ian Duncan Smith, is running scared of coming formally before this Parliament's Welfare Reform Committee? No answer to that. Continuing, Presiding Officer, we've heard of the deleterious impact of these cuts in child benefit and the impact they will have on hard-pressed families in very difficult economic times in Scotland. Such times, the difficulty of such economic times, of course, being exacerbated by the austerity agenda being pursued by the Tory Liberal government in London. But how can it possibly be fair to cut these benefits from, for example, a single parent earning over £50,000 when that person's next door neighbours, a couple with a household income of £100,000 equally divided, will not see such cuts for their child benefit? What an incoherent and essentially unfair policy, and how much public money is being wasted on the administration of this damaging burden to hard-pressed families. We hear that it will cost around £113 to £118 million of public money to administer this system over the first 4 years. And of course that should not come as any surprise, for means testing is costly, is unduly complex and impacts negatively on take-up. And we've seen that with Gordon Brown's flagship pension credit, where even approaching the 10-year mark, there are nearly a third of pensioners who are eligible to take up pension credit who are not taking it up as a result of its means-tested approach. But of course, it's not just the cuts in child benefit that are hammering hard-pressed families in Scotland, because what we are seeing, I believe, is a head-on assault on the welfare system. And of course, the welfare system is supposed to be provide a safety net, and that is the mark of a decent society. We've heard about the miserable 1% cap on benefits uprating and the impact that that will have. And of course, we've heard also about the changes to the tax credit system, which will impact again on hard-pressed families and their children. And of course, we have also heard of the ridiculous and unfair bedroom tax and the huge impact that is going to have on households across Scotland. I could go on, Presiding Officer, but I'm conscious of the time this afternoon. But this cynical and systematic dismantling of the welfare system by the UK government is something that simply is not tenable in our country. For we have the opportunity in the autumn of 2014, in response to the question, should Scotland be an independent country, to say yes. Yes, Scotland should be an independent country. Yes, Scotland should take control over all its resources and over the welfare system so that we can ensure that we establish here in our country a welfare system that better reflects Scotland's values. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now call on Neil Bibby to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I join other members in welcoming the debate this afternoon. Can I say from the outset the Labour Party is absolutely committed to supporting children and families. It was the Labour Party who introduced child benefit, and it was the last Labour government who supported this with child tax credits as part of a drive to eradicate child poverty and to help families. An OECD report states that over 500,000 children were pulled out of poverty by the last Labour governments elected by the Scottish people. Considerable progress and achievements have been made, but that has unfortunately now stalled and is in danger of increasing rapidly. As Drew Smith said, child benefit has been paid universally because as a society we all have a responsibility towards all the nation's children. The coalition government's changes to the system are wrong, and I agree with Nicola Sturgeon on that. Let me be clear, Labour doesn't support cutting child benefit, and we certainly don't support it at the same time as the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are not at the moment, are giving tax cuts for millionaires and tax cuts for big businesses. They have their priorities all wrong. As has been mentioned earlier,
Jamie Hepburn.
The member has set out that Labour don't support cutting child benefit, but Malcolm Chisholm is sitting behind Mr Bibby in the row behind. I seem to recall Mr Chisholm resigning from government because that's exactly what they did when they were in government.
Neil Bibby.
We don't support cutting the current changes to child benefit because certainly at the moment, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are cutting taxes for millionaires and big business and corporation tax cuts, which the SNP also support tax cuts for big businesses as well. We need to remember that. As has been mentioned already, the coalition government's changes mean nearly 100,000 families in Scotland are set to lose a reported average of £1,200 in child benefit this year, with a majority of those losing their child benefit already. This will have serious repercussions on the levels of child poverty. And looking ahead, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who were regularly quoted by the Conservatives in opposition, has said that thousands more households will lose the benefit over the next years because the threshold for receiving it will remain fixed and not take into account wage inflation. There are serious failings in this policy, including the administrative complexities that Drew Smith said earlier. As I said before, I agree with Nicola Sturgeon that these policies are wrong, but I think it's important to focus this afternoon on what we can do to support families in Scotland and throughout the UK. Presiding Officer, we all know we need an economic recovery. We need to support parents back to work, and we need to make work pay. How can we encourage parents back to work if they are paid £6 an hour at the same time as they are paying £5 an hour in childcare costs? This is not how you rebuild an economy and get people back to work. The cuts to tax credits and child benefit will certainly not help, but what is the Scottish Government doing to help parents with childcare? Tom McInnes of the highly respected Joseph Rowntree Foundation hit the nail on the head when he said action cannot wait. They, like so many others, have shown that this Parliament has the powers and resources to effect change now. Today in this Parliament we have a chance to make a difference. The Scottish Government should use its power and resources to support families. Ministers have regularly talked about the extension of nursery hours for 3- and 4-year-olds, but the reality is you've been talking about this since 2007. You won't solve the childcare problems of 2013 with a 6-year-old policy. a policy you've still not implemented, and a policy you will not implement until 2014 at the earliest. As I've said before in this chamber, one rehashed or recycled policy, no matter how good, will not deal with the problems that parents face. Your policy to guarantee only about 1% of 2-year-olds early learning and care is not good enough either, particularly when you see the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are planning to offer 40% of 2-year-olds nursery in England. It is clear that the Scottish Government is not doing enough to help families with childcare. They try to speak the language of social justice, but fall down when it comes to the crunch. They fail to act, while on this side of the chamber we campaign to end the scourge of child poverty in Paisley and in Plymouth, because it's not acceptable anywhere. On this side of the chamber, we continue to view childcare as a major priority because it's an issue of equality and fairness. We need a model of childcare in which costs are reasonable and under which parents know their children will receive high-quality care. That's why when you say you need the powers to improve benefits for children, people will ask, what would you do with them? Although I didn't agree with everything Willie Rennie's speech, he did make an important point. SNP ministers would be careful to promise billions of pounds of benefits promises in an independent Scotland. People will rightly question whether this is simply a slick soundbite, when in actual fact you are not using the current powers and resources you already have, and how you will increase benefits when you also support corporation tax cuts for big business. Rather than simply call for more powers, I hope the Minister will outline positive steps the Scottish Government will now take to give families and the support they need now. A starting point, Presiding Officer, would be supporting Labour's call for investment in colleges and housing that could create jobs and opportunities to break the cycle of poverty. Because the reality is that progress was made on child poverty under Labour and has stalled under this government.
You must
Presiding Officer, the Labour Party has consistently demonstrated our commitment to children and families in Scotland and across the UK. I hope other parties will show their commitment.
Thank you. Can I remind members to address the remarks through the chair, please? I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard a lot today about some of the high-level figures that are taking place here in terms of the cuts and how many families that are going to affect. And sometimes we think too much in these high levels in this place. And I want to initially talk about some of the conversations that I have had in my constituency in recent times about these child benefit cuts. Because just as they were taking place, a woman from my constituency whose husband works in the oil industry, works offshore, who earns slightly over £50,000 a year. She has a part-time job as a cleaner, and she was talking about the impact that there would be on them, on the money that they would lose because of these changes. Now, a lot of folk will say, if her husband's earning £50,000 a year, they're probably pretty well off. But we all know that lots of people do struggle, no matter what their earnings may be. And beyond that, the thing is, as she rightly pointed out, I am not so bothered about us losing money if I knew that that money was going to somebody in society poorer than me. But that is not the case. And she said that it was particularly galling that a household where there may be two earners of just less than £50,000 would retain those benefits. This debate went on for some while, I have to say. This lady had her head screwed on without a doubt, because she then went on to talk about the concept of universality. Now, the Labour Party have stated that they introduced family allowance in 1946, replacing that with child benefit in 1975. And that is something for the Labour Party, I think, to be proud of. But what I do have a problem with at this moment in time is I do not know where the Labour Party actually stands on universality anymore. The conversation with a lady in my constituency went on because she said if this is a universal benefit that is going to be cut from Westminster, What one is next? Is it going to be the state pension? Is the state pension going to be the next universal benefit that goes? You know, how can the population at large trust the parties at Westminster on this issue? My colleague Annabel Ewing has already pointed out that in his 2009 speech to the Tory conference, Chancellor George Osborne said that they would preserve child benefit and other universal benefits. How can folk believe what he has to say? And Mr Rennie, who refused to take an intervention, his leader, Nick Clegg, said just before the last election, we are not putting child benefit into question. Yet, once again, another U-turn from the Liberals, another failed manifesto promise. How can anyone trust the Liberals on this issue too? But it's Labour's position that really intrigues me. I have a quote here. The government planned to pay the deficit down on the backs of those with low and middle incomes, with a threat to universal benefits such as child benefit and the winter fuel payment. It is essential that we defend these payments. The alternative is a dangerous erosion of the social solidarity that comes from a universal system. So said Ed Miliband in The Observer on the 29th of August 2010. Yet here in Scotland, I have to question the Scottish Labour Party's position on universality, what with Joanne Lamont's proposed Cuts Commission. And I think that you need to tell the Scottish people in the debate today where you actually stand on the principle of universality. For me, I believe that universality is key to that social cohesion. And you know, in other states, other small European countries, we see a similar mindset. I'll take a brief intervention from Ms Bailey.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you to the member, and I will indeed be brief. Can you take the principle you've just outlined and apply it to the debate we had on legal aid, where you abandoned any question of universality and decided to means test and target?
And
Kevin Stewart.
I would say to Ms Bailey that today's debate is round about welfare, and it's welfare universality that I am concerned with today. And I would like to turn to those small European countries, some of our near neighbours. Denmark, child allowance is paid to children families with children under 18. Sweden, again, families under 16 benefit. In Norway, they have just raised that from 16 to 18. And in Finland, it is paid until children reach the age of 17. None of these benefits are means tested. None of them. So why here in Scotland are we facing the disastrous prospect of means testing, not only in this area, but also in many others? And how can we trust Westminster, any of the Westminster parties, to ensure that universality and welfare remains? That is why I think that this Parliament needs control over welfare, and I hope the people of Scotland vote yes in 2014 to allow that to happen.
Thank you. I call Christina McKelvey to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you very much. Deputy Presiding Officer, family allowances were one of Beveridge's 3 assumptions. The 3 assumptions were the things which were needed to make the social security system workable. The others being an NHS free at the point of need, how innovative, and an avoidance of mass unemployment. 5 shillings per week were given for each child after the first, and it was the legal entitlement of the mother, not the father. The reason the child benefit was paid to the women was to ensure that the money was spent directly on the child. According to the campaigning groups, the Fawcett Society and the Women's Budget Working Group, more than 70% of the 18 billion cuts to social security and welfare fall on women. 1/5 of the female wage consists of benefits to compensate, for instance, for the low wages associated with female-dominated sectors such as care and retail. Benefits make up only 1/10 of the male wage. Child benefit changes will actually increase dependency of women on men. Now, removing child benefit from families in which one earner pays higher rate tax impacts almost 100% on women and indirectly on their children. The UK Government's proposals seem to reflect outdated prejudices, giving the impression that the goal is a world of breadwinning men and home-making wives. We now have a situation in which stay-at-home motherhood is viewed in distinctly pejorative terms by the UK coalition politicians. How else to explain the withdrawal of universal child benefit and the promise, instead of a childcare tax break, that you will be forced to hand over the baby to the childminder you can't afford to make you more economically viable? Parents currently contribute 33% of their total net household income on childcare, compared to 11% in France and 4% in Belgium. Taking the cuts to childcare and the cap on in-work benefits, together with the ludicrous plan to rip Scotland out of the EU social chapter, what we have here is the biggest attacks on the rights of women since before the suffrage movement hailed victory with the right to vote in the 1928 Act. Deputy Presiding Officer Burns said, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children lisp the rights of man, amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention. The EU social chapter gives women the right to maternity leave, the right to equal pay, the right to a pension and the right to protections in her workplace. Official figures released following the Office of National Statistics and Analysis in December 2012 showed that Britain is now the most unequal country in Europe. What an achievement. I do hope the UK Government are proud of such an accolade. It is also a lesser-known fact that the welfare reforms, of which child benefit reform is included, has never had an equality impact analysis. What a disgrace. No thought or attention given to who or how damaging these reforms are. No thought or attention given to the fact that the biggest losers are low-paid women and their families. So let's look at a woman who, for many reasons, may find herself on her own with her children. She listens to the government who tells her she has to work, so she builds herself a career, with around 40% of her earnings going on childcare. If she earns £19,869 a year, she will lose £9.32 per week. That cash, Presiding Officer, could make at least 2 family meals, send a child on a school trip, or pay for, depending on the many hours you need, some after-school care. These are the choices parents are having to make every day of the week, and the UK Government couldn't be bothered to merit those women some attention. Now, that woman, folks, works hard, she gets a better job, she builds up to a senior level, she lands a job earning around 60 grand a year, and just as she's feeling that she has made it in a difficult world for women to reach such heady heights of senior levels, the UK Government say to her, we need your help to sort out the mess we made of the economy. So the child benefit you have depended on to pay for that school trip, or to pay for that after-school care, or to pay for that childcare will be removed, but your next-door neighbours, who are earning £49,000 a year, each will keep theirs. How can that be fair? How can anyone say a combined wage of £98,000 of your neighbours is okay, but it's not okay for you on your own to earn £60,000? And let's not forget, Presiding Officer, that it was Tony Blair himself as Prime Minister who introduced the welfare reform agenda, and with his plans realised by the Tories at Westminster, we will have another, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, 85,000 children plunged into poverty in Scotland alone over the next few years, 1 million across the UK. Now, the Labour Party sit over there with a synthetic outrage at how far their Better Together pals are going, when in fact they would have done the exact same thing. I wonder whether a requirement, or indeed a training need, for Labour members is to take a course in revisionism. History seems only to start the day they come to power and ends the day they leave it. Labour, the great revisionists. Now, this inequality is the way things will be for many Scottish women for several years to come. They will disproportionately forfeit prospects, employment, pay and pension. This is an abrogation of the social contract between citizen and government, a loss to the economy, and ultimately it exacts a high price on us all. Presiding Officer, it's a price that we should not have to pay. The Unionists laughed at the misfortune of independent Iceland. They are not laughing now. Independent Iceland jailed its bankers and bailed out her people, actually increasing child benefit at the most difficult time. Should Scotland be an independent nation? Yes, I think it should.
Yeah. Thank you. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Jimmy Dee.
Presiding Officer, I always like to agree with the Cabinet Secretary whenever I can, and I agreed with much of what she said, except, of course, the conclusion which she drew as embodied in the last 2 lines of her motion, and indeed her attacks on Scottish Labour's position, to which I shall return, but which did not surprise me. What did surprise me was the actual wording of the motion, because the whole motion is about child benefit. But I, and I'm sure all my colleagues on this benches, have been concerned not just about the attack on child benefit, but also the wider attack on tax credits and other changes in the welfare reform law. But of course, when we think of tax credits, and incidentally, Jamidi raised a point about them, I think they are that integration of tax, and in a moment, that integration of tax and benefit that he asked for. But when we think of tax credits, we are reminded that the welfare state has always been a mixture of universal and targeted benefits. But of course, that cannot be admitted by the SNP in their motion or their rhetoric, because of course it undermines the whole basis of their attack on Labour in this Parliament. I'll give way now.
I thank Mr Chisholm for giving way. He suggests that the Labour, he's surprised by the terms of the motion before us, and he suggests that the Labour Party are worried about a number of other things, as these benches are as well, of course, tax credits. I'm just wondering if they're so concerned, why does their amendment not mention these issues?
Well, I think it's very well known that what our position on tax credits is, because we've been leading a campaign across the UK opposing the £4 billion that are being taken out of tax credits in the current welfare reform bill, and that's on top of other changes such as the cut to the childcare tax credit, which have already fed their way into the system. So I am proud of Labour's record on tax credits and other targeted benefits, but I am also proud of Labour's record on child benefit. I'm proud of what we're saying now on it, because we want to keep child benefit as a universal benefit, and we've said we would pay for that by reversing the £3 billion tax cut which the richest people in the UK have gained from. I'm proud of what we said about child benefit in the 2010 election. We said we would uprate it beyond inflation. And I'm also, because I have a long political memory, proud of what the Labour government of the 1960s did, when in 1967 they put a very significant increase into family allowance, paid for by taxation on those well-off in society. So I don't need any lectures, and my colleagues don't need any lectures about defending the welfare state. The simple fact of the matter is that the best way to defend the welfare state is to elect a Labour government in 2015. And that is why the last two lines of the motion, which of course are the heart of the SNP's case this afternoon, are quite simply untrue. But of course they do reveal significantly how the SNP intend to frame the referendum debate and how, crucially, they intend to invent their enemies. I give way.
I thank Mr Chisholm for giving way. He says the best way to defend the welfare state is to elect a Labour government. In 1997, he resigned as a minister because Labour were cutting benefits. They were doing so by following the plans of the Tory government that they took office from. Is there not an issue there about learning the lessons of history?
Malcolm Chisholm.
Well, if Labour made one mistake since we invented the welfare state in 75 years, I don't think that's too much to complain about, considering all the other excellent things we have done to create and defend the welfare state since 1945. But of course, the last two lines of the motion are not just referring to reserved issues, but also to devolved issues as well. And that was, of course, the point of my intervention to the Cabinet Secretary, because the last two lines of the motion also repeat what the First Minister said very surprisingly at the SNP conference, where he said that the only way to defend what the SNP called universal benefits in this Parliament is to vote for independence, which was my question to the Cabinet Secretary. Is she seriously saying that if there is a no vote in 2014, that the SNP would be unable to campaign in the 2016 election to defend what they call universal benefits in this Parliament, whether it's free personal care, free concessionary travel or free education? Well, that was the point of my intervention. But of course, more importantly, universal benefits currently are being used as a stick with which to beat the Labour Party, and I'll repeat the phrase, also to invent the Labour Party, because we've had, even this afternoon, some astonishing examples. We've had Kevin Stewart saying that the pension's going to be abolished. We regularly have SNP people on Twitter and elsewhere saying we're going to abolish concessionary travel. And we even have people from time to time saying that because we're questioning one or two universal services or the way that they're implemented, we're against the National Health Service. I mean, this is patent nonsense. I give way to Kevin Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr Chisholm for giving way. And what I actually said was the fact that child benefit being slashed from the universal system, what is next on the agenda? Will that be the state pension? That could well happen, Mr Chisholm. Let's be honest here. If they've done it with child benefit and they said prior to the election they wouldn't, both parties, What's to say they won't do the same with the state pensions?
Well, if Kevin Stewart was listening, he would know that I was talking about Labour policy here. And these are arguments that are being used against Labour, and they're used obviously against what Labour is saying in this Parliament and what we're saying in the UK. The reality is that the Labour Party invented the NHS. There is always a debate about how much it's going to be within the universal scope, and that's what the argument about free prescriptions, for example, is about, and free personal care, which obviously I supported and extended into the universal principle. But let's be honest about this debate. The welfare state is always a mixture of the universal and targeted, and it would help the debate if the SNP could recognise that. I would give way if I was allowed to, but I don't think the presiding officer will let me.
I could give you an extra 30 seconds maximum. Cabinet Secretary.
Simple question. I just wonder why somebody of Malcolm Chisholm's principles seems to prefer a Tory government at Westminster to having a Labour government in an independent Scotland.
Malcolm Chisholm. I know my colleagues are working inexorably to have a Labour government in the UK in 2015, and that is what we'll obviously strive to achieve, and we believe obviously that will happen, and that is the best way to defend the welfare state.
Thank you. I now call Jimmy Day to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too wish to put on record my opposition to these changes to child benefit. Several colleagues have already spoken eloquently and powerfully this afternoon about the effect of freezing and capping child benefit will have. Kevin Stewart, Annabel Ewing, Malcolm Chisholm in a characteristically stylish contribution. Not that I agreed with all that he had to say. And I share their concerns and criticisms of these attacks on families. Now, the Prime Minister said in 2005 that a modern, compassionate conservatism is right for our times and right for our country. Well, these changes may be right for the millionaires and the super rich who will benefit from the cut in the higher rate of income tax, but they are not right for the 90,000 families across Scotland who will see their household incomes and living standards fall as a result of these changes. These families will effectively have their benefit cut, allow me to make some progress if I may, have their benefit cut or for 2/3 of them withdrawn altogether. These cuts are unfair and ill-conceived and will have a significant effect on all the families affected. But most concerning of all, these changes, as the Deputy First Minister outlined in her contribution, represent an ideological attack on the idea of universal benefits and the role of the state in supporting children. Happily give way to Mr Johnson.
Does the member accept that the numbers he quotes there are only accurate if we consider the child benefit changes in isolation? But that's not the case. Many of these families will be significant beneficiaries of the tax threshold changes.
Well, even if that was true, and I have some doubts about the member's figures, there's no point in improving the situation with regard to taxation if you then remove people's entitlement to universal benefits. But there's also another reason why we should safeguard universal benefits, like child benefit, as a building block of a fair society, and that is that they build social cohesion and they help to promote social justice. If the UK Government would only listen to families and to organisations who are in regular contact with families, they would understand that child benefit is both popular and effective precisely because it is so simple and the fact that it is targeted at children. As the head of the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland, John Dickey, has said, if the UK Government wants to target higher rate taxpayers, it should do it through progressive taxation so that households without children share the burden. A vitally important feature of child benefit is that it is paid directly to the main carer for the child or children, overwhelmingly women, as Christina McKelvey reminded us. And research has shown it is spent on children. Research by the Child Poverty Action Group shows that child benefit is used by parents of all social classes for clothes and shoes, for food and essential items like nappies and education-related items. According to HMRC, the average family affected by these cuts will have £1,300 less to spend on these products every year, and that's according to the Parliament's Information Centre. That will be a painful change in the pockets of those families and those households, and the number of families affected are significant. Here in Edinburgh, 5,000 families will completely lose their entitlement, and in my own constituency of Edinburgh Southern, over 700 families. I pause too to reflect on the effect on our economy. An average cut of £1,300 applied to 90,000 families represents just under £120 million lost to the Scottish economy every year, at a time when Mr Osborne's austerity is driving us to the brink of a triple-dip recession. Another tax on family spending is surely the last thing that we need. Contrast the efforts of the Scottish Government to protect family budgets at every turn through measures such as the council tax freeze, free prescriptions and concessionary travel. That contrast and approach explains exactly why the motion we are debating calls for recognition that it is only through the full powers which independence can bring that we can properly protect the universal benefits that produce fair and equitable outcomes. Furthermore, the changes are also ludicrously complicated. HMRC has required to introduce 15 new pages onto its website to explain the policy to the millions of confused families. Advice organisations are concerned that many families may stop claiming child benefit when they do not need to, and that this policy will add to hardship when income fluctuates or when couples separate and create an added financial strain on relationships. But it is the attack on the universal nature of child benefit that most alarms me. And it is the Child Poverty Action Group Scotland who have made the point that while at first glance the changes may not seem likely to have a direct impact on child poverty, the undermining of this simple universal benefit will have lasting implications for the role of the state in supporting children. An extra allowance for children has been a feature of the tax or social security system since the beginning of the 20th century, a point that was effectively made by Drew Smith in his contribution. Every other European country except Italy offers a universal child benefit or a child tax allowance to all children. Campaigners worry that the effect of these changes, along with other cuts, is that people are made to feel guilty about receiving a benefit which was once a proud pillar of the welfare state, and that children are seen as a burden for the few rather than the future for everyone in this country. The rhetoric of us all being in this together has long since been exposed, as the majority of high earners who do not have children are not affected, and those with earnings over $150,000, few of whom have children living with them, have even had their tax cut. These child benefit changes will have a profound social impact on children and families across Scotland. They will take significant economic resources and disposable income and money circulating in the Scottish economy and in local economies and communities. We in this Parliament can do better, and with independence we will do better for the children, families and communities of Scotland.
Thank you. I now call Jane Baxter to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The changes to the benefits system are being met with anxiety and anger in communities across the UK. And we know it is not just members in this Parliament who have been debating welfare reform. However, here and now in Scotland, there are ways we can challenge the impact of these cuts on ordinary families. So what is disappointing about the motion that we see from the Scottish Government today is that it offers nothing more concrete than all would be different in an independent Scotland. I'm therefore pleased that Labour's amendment references the Joseph Rowntree Foundation monitoring report on poverty and social exclusion, which recognises that there are a number of areas such as health, childcare, schools and housing which fall within the current legislative powers of the Scottish Government. The report goes on to note it's important that the discussion of independence does not obscure the need for policy development in all these areas to tackle problems that will exist whatever decision the Scottish people take in 2014. Colleagues yesterday spoke of the problems of increased cost of living, forcing people to resort to payday loan lenders and trapping people in a cycle of debt. And it is, of course, worrying that changes to the welfare system in this country could also be driving people in the same direction. Taking action on high-cost lenders is just one example of what we could and should be doing to help people now. And that needs to sit alongside doing all we can to promote and encourage credit unions as thriving, sustainable social enterprises, providing a service for everyone in the community and bringing real diversity to Scotland's financial services sector. The need for such assistance is highlighted in the recent survey undertaken by the Poverty Alliance and Fife Gingerbread, which has researched the experiences of lone parents in rural Fife. The report is called Surviving Poverty, the Impact of Lone Parenthood, and what is clear to those who have read the report is the uncertainty and fear which changes to the welfare system are causing now to people in Fife, and I'm sure the views described are replicated across Scotland. Lone parents face a number of issues aside from changes to the benefit system that affect their experience of poverty. These include finding adequate and affordable housing, education, training and employment, childcare and advice and support services. And as some estimates suggest that the real income of a one-parent family will be reduced by over £500 by 2015, it may only get worse. In the survey, 71% of respondents described either great difficulty or some difficulty in making ends meet. That is a shockingly high figure for people just trying to get by in their day-to-day lives. When 6 out of 10 poor children in the UK live in families where at least one parent works, then the thousands of families who are struggling on a day-to-day basis need to know what help they can expect now. I know from speaking to volunteers at Home Start in Fife that they are inundated now by concerns amongst the families they work with about welfare changes. And last Saturday, I met with volunteers and trustees at Dunfermline Food Bank and heard how local churches and community groups have enlisted the help of supermarkets and other local businesses to work at the front line of the fight against poverty, supporting individuals and families to meet that most basic of needs, food. They raised with me the concern that many of their clients don't even have enough money for the bus and are walking sometimes long distances in all weathers to and from the food bank depot. But whilst I'm grateful for the efforts and achievements of everyone involved in food banks, I'm sure they would agree with me that this is no substitute for finding solutions to the poverty which is driving the demand. Rural communities across Mid Scotland and Fife face additional problems in getting access to vital support services. Information is sometimes hard to find. There is less access to community and social support networks, and transport might not be available or affordable, thus leaving many families isolated and without the support they need. Therefore, I was pleased to hear the recent announcement by the Scottish Government of funds for frontline advice and support services, but more detail on how and when this will be available needs to be forthcoming. I'd be grateful if the Minister could clarify how much of the £5.4 million that has apparently been made available to agencies to respond to the need for support and assistance will be available directly to councils and their community planning partners, as many public sector bodies are already bearing the brunt of budget cuts and yet are being faced with increased demand for advice services. The Poverty Alliance in its report goes as far as to say that the importance of advice, assisting people with income maximisation and support for those in and out of employment should be a priority in local and national anti-poverty strategies and should be included in the new single outcome agreements. It's therefore disappointing that we see no such practical suggestions or useful policy indications in the motion before us of how the Government intends to counteract any negative impacts of welfare changes on the lives of people in Scotland using the existing powers which they already have. I believe that this motion from the Scottish Government could have been used to engage more constructively across the Chamber to discuss the impacts of welfare reform, and I hope that we can see such dialogue in the future. People who are being hit the hardest need the help now. They cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, President Officer. And I should declare an interest at the outset of this debate as my family are beneficiaries of child benefit. Can I say, just as I set out at the start of the debate we had on fuel poverty, I can't exactly say I welcome this debate because I prefer that these changes won't happen, but I think it is important that we debate this matter. And before I get into the detail, can I say to Malcolm Chisholm, who is someone I normally very much enjoy listening to, I think it was somewhat galling to hear his upset about the Labour Party being accused of cutting bus passes. In the first instance, I would remind him it's his party that has set up a cuts commission where nothing is off the table. And can I also tell him I have lost count of the number of times I have been out canvassing on behalf of my party, and I've met an individual who has told me, informed me that they believe my party is going to cut the bus pass. Now we know, and I'll let you in a minute, Mr Chisholm, now we know, Presiding Officer, it's the SNP that's preserving the bus pass, and it's Labour that threatens it. Mr Chisholm.
Malcolm Chisholm.
As I've said before, I totally support the review, but it's quite a different thing to say we're going to abolish concessionary travel. We're maybe looking at modifying it. For example, Age Scotland, as the member knows, it came up at the Finance Committee 2 weeks ago, want to modify it. Does he reject their suggestion as well?
Jamie Hepburn.
I reject the suggestion, as I have heard on countless times, that it's this party, the SNP, that's going to abolish the bus pass. And quite frankly, I thought that was an unconvincing explanation as to say why the charge cannot be levelled against the Labour Party. But let me get on to child benefit, because that's what we're debating. Presiding Officer, let's look at how it's affecting people here in Scotland. We know that child benefit cuts will see a family of two lose over £1,100 a family with one child, over £650 a year. And according to the UK government itself, in the next financial year, approximately 85,000 families in Scotland will be affected by the high income child benefit charge, which will reduce or remove their benefit. And of course, this creates, I think this has been referred to, the nonsensical situation. I think it's absolutely bizarre that they have come up with a formula whereby a single income family earning over £50,000 will lose child benefit, whereas a couple with a combined household income of just under £100,000 might not. And I think even we see Ian Duncan's favoured think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, criticising that aspect. And of course, we see other flaws with the higher rate as well. But lest we think that this is affecting just higher earners, of course, it's not just the higher paid who are affected by child benefit changes, because we've seen the benefit uprating bill recently passed at Westminster, limiting increases in working age benefits to 1% for 3 years, and this is affecting child benefit as well, and that is going to, of course, affect people at the lower end of the income scale. And of course, we have seen today the Daily Record has published an article that sets out with these changes some 15,000 more children in relative poverty in Scotland, 200,000 children in relative poverty across the UK. And can I say to Drew Smith, we're all concerned about kids being pushed into poverty anywhere, but frankly, I think his party's unwillingness to see the powers invested here cannot be used. I'm not going to go back to my constituents and say we're not going to do anything for you because other parties in this place aren't confident enough to take the powers here. If we had the powers, we could help our constituents. And I always think it's a bit of a phony solidarity. I think Mark MacDonald made this point very well. It seems that the social solidarity the Labour Party has ends and extends no further than the end of the White Cliffs of Dover. Can also talk about the issue of universality, because we are, with these changes, making it child benefit a targeted measure is going to make it far more complex. And I think I don't have time to go into that in great detail, but I do think there is concerns, and I know that the Scottish Government has set out solidarity and cohesion as two of its main purpose targets, and the SCVO has suggested that a move away from universality reduces solidarity. And I think the point was also made by my colleague Mr Stewart that this is a position as espoused in the Observer by the leader of the Labour Party. I agree with Ed Miliband that the alternative to attacking or to keeping universal benefits such as a child benefit is a dangerous erosion of the social solidarity that comes from a universal system, and I think Labour members in this place would do well to reflect on that. Can I turn to the amendments before us? Look at the Tory amendment. First of all, frankly, for it to conclude that many people will benefit from the forthcoming rollout of the universal credit on a day when, as I say, the Daily Record has published an article that says 15,000 children in Scotland will fall below the poverty line as a consequence of these changes, is somewhat galling. And can I remind the Labour benches, the Tory benches, that these are the DWP figures. These are their own government's figures that suggest this. And I can also gently ask Alec Johnson, can I pose the question, can he, and because he's on the Welfare Reform Committee like me, Presiding Officer, can he name a single witness that has come to our committee that has spoke of the benefit of these changes? Because I can't remember a single one. Can I also turn very briefly to the Labour amendment, where they suggest that the issues that are central to tackling poverty, such as health, childcare, schools and housing, fall within current legislative powers of the Scottish Government? Well, indeed, they do. But the suggestion is that the Scottish Government is doing nothing. Let me remind the Labour benches that the SNP and Government has protected the NHS budget when they wouldn't ring-fence it. Let me remind the Labour benches that we have seen the Scottish Government looking to roll out increased hours of nursery education in terms of free tuition in education, and indeed delivering more affordable homes. So the idea that because we heard from the Labour benches about all the great achievements from the 40s, the 60s and the 70s, this government's achieving here and now, but we could do much more with the powers of independence.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin with a Burns quote, and I feel it's very apt for today's debate, because this debate is about the type of Scotland we want to live in and it's about our values and our choices. And it's one heard very frequently in January. Old Scotland wants nae skinking wear that jaups and luggies. And Scotland does not want a watered-down welfare system that does nothing to fill the bowls of our citizens. Time and again, Scotland has shown that she wants the bowls filled with haggis, the full boona, whatever. What we mean is that we want a welfare system built on the principles of universalism, from each according to the ability to each according to need, and from the cradle to the grave. And we know that Scotland wants this from the overwhelming vote in 2011 in the elections for policies of universalism in the SNP manifesto. Free education, free prescriptions, free personal care being some of the examples. They are now being described as a something-for-nothing society. But I say to the Labour benches, as soon as you question why should the middle classes or the upper classes benefit from universal services, you've lost the principle of what they're about. The normalisation of welfare and building our citizens, certainly.
Drew Smith.
Member could perhaps take some time in our speech then to explain why the Scottish Government introduced means testing into the central heating programme.
Claire Adamson.
We've been accused of not walking the walk. I think the Scottish people have showed that they support our record when it comes to universal services. And there's more evidence for why Scotland wants this. On the 29th of May 2009, Scotland's Futures Forum and Glasgow University's Poverty Information Unit co-hosted a conference in this chamber to explore the extent to which the Scottish Parliament in its first decade had reduced poverty and inequalities, and to consider what the Parliament should be doing in the next 10 years. And it has some key conclusions, not all of which I can mention today. But one of them was inequalities of income and wealth have changed little in recent decades. It's a corrosive effect on society, all sections of society, in all its sections of society. It's therefore vital that we tackle inequality as much as poverty. High-quality public services that are accessible to all but meet the needs of most vulnerable are crucial to ensuring a more equal society. One of the contributors looked to the spirit level, quote, why more equal societies almost always do better, to show that an equal society benefits all sections of society, including the richest, who benefit from lower mortality rates and mental health. This benefit of an equal society is also evidenced in the Reid Foundation report, The Case for Universalism, which examines the debate in Scotland today. And Mr Smith said he wanted this debate, but I was very disappointed that a debate on this very report was stopped from happening in this chamber because not one member of the Labour Party felt that they could support the principles on which all of the welfare benefits that they brought in were based. In the report, in the section on international comparisons and contrasts, it examines the Nordic model of a truly universal welfare state. And it quotes, "Such an approach to organising society and the economy has been described as a broad range of social services and benefits that are intended to cover the entire population throughout the different stages of life, and the benefits are delivered on the basis of uniform rules and eligibility. A typical example would be universal childcare or universal child allowances that are distributed without any forms of means testing. Such an inclusion welfare state inevitably has the consequences for the whole of the community. The welfare system is not just for the poor, but for all, building social cohesion, solidarity and inclusion." By any comparison, the Nordic countries individually, as evidenced by Kevin Stewart, and collectively occupy the highest ranks in indexes of income, wealth, happiness, life satisfaction and equality. The lowest levels of poverty and inequality in the world. Our economic and fiscal choices should be about the society we aspire to. Recognition that stigmatism, alienation, poverty traps simply impede the economic and social cohesiveness. And this is the argument that should be taking central stage today. It's about philosophy. It's not about fiscal decisions. Scotland's Future Forum also came up with some aspirations for Scotland. They were looking for a more progressive tax system, reduction in educational inequalities, reduction in the inequality of wealth as well as income, high-quality public services accessible to all, and these are very welcome aspirations. This debate in Scotland has been at the fore recently, and I saw Douglas Alexander on the Politics Show trying to defend the indefensible, the Labour Party's lurch to the right. In doing so, he quoted Bevan, "The language of priorities is the religion of socialism." He coined this phrase in 1949. But perhaps Mr Alexander and other Labour politicians should read the 1959 speech. 10 years later, following Labour's defeat, and after Bevan had long parted company with the Labour front benches over the introduction of prescription charges, which he saw as an abandonment of the founding principles of the NHS, he said, "I once said it was the language of priorities with the religion of socialism. There's nothing wrong with this statement, but you can only get your priorities right if you have the power to put them right. The argument is about power and only about power, because only by the possession of power can you get the priorities correct." I look forward to the day where the power is in the hands of a Scottish Government and an independent Scotland.
Thank you. I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. That the UK coalition has tampered with child benefit in an indefensibly inequitable way is beyond question. Sadly, though, it's a done deal. It's right that we here discuss this important issue as it impacts on the lives of over 90,000 people here in Scotland. Indeed, this afternoon we have an opportunity to debate a vision of a Scotland that puts the welfare of our children at the heart of society. As you know, child benefit has its origins in post-war Britain, when the ruling coalition then sought to ease the burden on families suffering amid housing shortages and food rationing. But with many families struggling to make ends meet and an increasing need for food banks, it's difficult to understand the rationale behind this current decision. Originally known as family allowance, it has undergone a couple of reinventions, as child benefit in the late 70s, and further changes came in the 90s with the introduction of a higher rate for the first child. Governments of various colours have continued to invest in this important benefit, which recognises the importance of each individual child in every household, not to mention the increasing costs of raising a child, highlighted recently in a report entitled From Cradle to College 2012, compiled by the Centre for Economics and Business Research, as having now soared to more than £218,000 by the time a child reaches age 21. We know that women earn less than men, and that austerity measures, unemployment and underemployment are impacting women disproportionately. A lack of affordable quality childcare, as Christina McKelvey pointed out, is an important factor too, and it deserves our undivided attention as it affects women and children in Scotland greatly. Those working in childcare are not well paid, but we have amongst the highest childcare costs in Europe, a factor which may be responsible for more women being forced into economic inactivity, as highlighted in Bernardo's recent Paying to Work report and raised by the STUC in the ongoing Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee inquiry into underemployment. As a reliable part of a family's income, child benefit may enable some women to stay at home and look after their own children, and it may help others to pay for that childcare. Within many households, income is not shared equally, a fact recognised by direct payment of child benefit to women in 94% of cases. Child benefit is an independent income that many women rely on. Yes, even some women, as Kevin Stewart pointed out, whose partners earn £50,000 and over. If a family with 2 or 3 children took on large mortgage debt when that was perhaps too easy to do, they may now, with changed circumstances, be struggling with payments, perhaps negative equity on their home. If we factor in credit card debts and the usual household bills, it's quite possible that a family may appear comfortably off while relying on child benefit for items, food, children's clothing. And for those women and children escaping domestic violence, child benefit may be the only source of income some women have. The excellent campaign work of Zero Tolerance long ago dispelled the myth that domestic abuse is only experienced by women from low-income households. The Fawcett Society, too, has questioned the impact of this policy, asking, does this change increase or reduce inequality between men and women? We know the answer. I want to live in a country where policies are fully evaluated for their impact on equalities, and even after decisions have been taken, the impact is measured and reviewed as necessary. The cross-party group on children and young people has discussed the extent to which government, local authorities, health boards and key agencies have statutory duties to consult children and young people about issues that affect them. Here in Scotland, legislation exists which encourages engagement and consultation with children and young people regarding the decisions which affect their lives. How many children were consulted about this policy? The Children and Young People's Bill offers an opportunity to discuss these issues fully and to strengthen children's rights, and I hope that we in this Parliament take full advantage of this. When the UK ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in December 1991, it agreed to make all laws, policy and practice compatible with the Convention. In 2010, the then Children's Minister, Sarah Taylor, made a written statement pledging that the government would give due consideration to the Convention when making new law and policy. Yet absolutely no consideration appears to have been given to the views of children who will be affected by changes to child benefit. The UK has ratified the Convention, but it is not being applied properly, even when benefits for children and young people are affected. Child benefit has been a universal benefit. Its mutuality has a benefit that should not be sacrificed. Article 27 of the Convention places an obligation on states to assist parents to meet the material needs of their children. Child benefit is society's small contribution to its children's welfare. The welfare of our youngest people is central as we debate our future. The Convention is worthy of a place in a national constitution, along with policies like universal child benefit. They say that children matter. Thank you.
Thank you. George Adam, to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For me, this debate, like many of the debates within this chamber, is about independence, because the opposition parties don't like to hear this, but the only way we will get the socially just Scotland that we aspire to have is through the powers of independence. Now, I've said it before that politics is about people, the people we represent, and how we represent them and the decisions we make that can make a difference in their life for them to aspire to actually have the lifestyle that we want them to have. And I would say to a lot of the Labour members in here that I would ask them to look at the arguments over the next next 18 months and see that what independence has to offer, because the union obviously isn't working, as the Deputy First Minister always said, in this case. Now, I respect the Labour Party for a lot of the things they've done in the past, the 1940s with the welfare state, and I respect Malcolm Chisholm, who was some of the things he said earlier on and what he says during debates. But the 1960s is a long time ago. It was, I wasn't even born, believe it or not, at that stage. But I'm talking about the here and now. I'm talking about children and families in Scotland at this time. And these are the people that we represent, and these are the people that we have to make decisions for. So why should we listen to a government, as the Deputy First Minister already said, that we didn't elect, that we would probably never elect? Why do we not work together to ensure that we can actually have the socially just Scotland that we all wish? Now, it's with regret I'm speaking at today's date about changes to our welfare system that will target the vulnerable and most needy in our society. How many of us stand by the thought of a society is judged by how we treat its weakest members? I would suggest most of us within here, although listening to some of the contributions from some members, there may be others that think otherwise, but child benefit, money that is meant to ensure the security of our children, reduced or removed from 90,000 families in Scotland, decided, as I've already mentioned, by a parliament we did not vote for and have no influence. They will take decisions that will affect Scotland, affect families across our country. The Westminster's own Department of Works and Pension has freely admitted that these welfare cuts will increase child poverty. Presiding Officer, after Mr Johnston's contributions, we can confirm that we are truly back in the Westminster age of the Thatcher era, when policies that search out and demonise and punish those in society that certain parts of the right-wing political spectrum think deserve it Yes, gladly, Mr Johnson.
Alec Johnson.
I fully respect the member's position and his aspirations. However, looking at the most recent available figures, I suspect that if Scotland were to become independent in a couple of years, that the overall budget that government would look at would be similar to the one we have today, perhaps slightly less given the possible increased borrowing costs. So given the same budget, where is he going to re-prioritise his spending to ensure that his aspirations in this area are achieved?
George Adam.
The cardinal difference, the main difference, Presiding Officer, from Mr Johnson's argument is that we would be in control of what we were deciding. It would be this Parliament and this place and the people of Scotland who would be making the decisions for our country, ensuring that we did have the future that we all aspire to. In an independent Scotland, we're told that the policy will increase child poverty. Do you think that this Parliament will say that that's a price worth paying? Not likely. But when it comes from a place that has no ability to change, or we must accept it, this is the human cost of the union. And it's something we have to remember when we're having these debates. Because, as I've said before, it's the women, children, fathers, daughters, mothers and families of Scotland that we represent, and we have to ensure that we do it to them best. So why not use the tax system to reduce the deficit that these unionist governments have created? Why not target those that have money or are deliberately avoiding tax, whether it's rich or multi-million-pound companies that we hear about every week? The Tories seem to think it's somehow more effective to create an administrative system that will reduce child benefits for a family of two by £1,100 a year. A system that will remove a family from child benefit if one member of the family earns £50,000 but keeps paying out to families if they earn £98,000. This will be a new system created to claw back from families the child benefit that are paid through income tax. The Scottish Government's budget has been reduced by the Tory government, even Tory Lib Dem government, even when the Scottish Government still has the opportunity to make a difference. This is in fact a story of a tale of two governments, one that cares and wants to be aspirational and look to the future for our people, and ones that actually just want the people of Scotland to know their role, know their place and not move any forward. It may interest some of the members here that we continue to have the best package of nursery care in the UK, increased free nursery provision by 20% and invested £11 million in Firm Family Nurse Partnership. It has extended free school meals to those in low incomes. These are not just aspirations, these are things that have happened within the straitjacket of devolution. For me, independence is the only way forward for the people of Scotland. This argument, like many of the arguments and debates we have in here, is a reason for Scotland to be independent. So should Scotland be independent? I would say yes.
Thank you. I call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm privileged to be speaking from the Labour Party benches on this issue. We have a history of supporting children and families, having increased child benefit, introduced child tax credits and fought against these child benefit reforms every step of the way. The Tories and Lib Dems in Westminster have the wrong priorities, cutting taxes for millionaires and big business while slashing welfare benefits like housing benefit and child benefit. This is an outright attack on the most needy in our society and will plunge more children into poverty. The changes being put in place by the coalition government mean that over 100,000 families in Scotland could each lose up to £1,200 a year. It's neither fair nor equitable that people earning over £150,000 are getting a tax cut, while single earner families on £50,000 are getting their child benefit cut. Of course, equality is not something that the Eton boys are familiar with. How can it be right that two people earning £49,000 each a year can still access full child benefit, while a family whose single income is £60,000 a year will get none? The Institute of Economic Affairs have called these child benefit changes the single most incompetent change to the benefit system since the Second World War, and I agree that they are deeply unfair and unjust. In the test of fairness, and even from a purely administrative standpoint, these child benefit reforms are a complete shambles. The Coalition need to look at how child benefit is paid. Save the Children believe that child benefit should be paid to the main carer or second earner in a couple family, which is usually the mother. This gives at least some comfort that the money will go towards the well-being of the child and avoid the difficulties that arise in a relationship where there is domestic abuse or where the partner doesn't provide adequately for the children. I hear the Scottish Government calling for more economic levers, and to that I say, what would you do with them? You have the power now to change things, but what are you doing? For example, it was announced last year that free childcare will increase by 125 hours to 600 hours. Yeah. I welcome this development, yet this was first announced in 2007 and then again in 2012. When female unemployment was rising year on year up to the 23% rise we saw between 2010 and 11, why wasn't action taken then? It was viable for the government to do so, yet it was delayed. So I ask this government, when will these changes come into play, as they could be of a real benefit in supporting children and families and reducing child poverty? We need to look at ways in which we can change the culture of childcare from expensive and inflexible to accessible for working parent families countrywide. A difficult task, but something we need to address. Many local authorities are considering the closure of after-school clubs and breakfast clubs because of budget constraints. These vital services are often the only way working mothers can afford to work. While council budgets are a decision for them to make, their cuts are a direct result of this government's policies, and this isn't supporting children and families. As I said at the start of this speech, in the Labour Party, we have a proud record when it comes to supporting children and families in government. And it's been mentioned many times in the debate this afternoon about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, and as it is in the amendment that we have put forward. And I make no excuse for repeating it again, just so that everyone in the SNP benches can hear it and listen, maybe. With the political debate dominated by the referendum on independence, it's important to point out that the issues that are central to tackling poverty, such as health, childcare, schools and housing, fall within the current legislative powers of the Scottish Government. The problems highlighted in this report cannot wait. Action can and should be taken now. We need clear direction and action from this government when it comes to supporting children and families. We have to move away from the sound bites and come up with practical solutions right now to protect those being hit by these cuts and tackle the real inequalities in Scotland. We need to start using the powers we have today to protect the most vulnerable and support children and families, so we can make sure our children get the best possible start in life. They shouldn't be used as a political football to score points against the coalition in Westminster. In this chamber, Labour will continue to speak out against these Tory and Lib Dem cuts, while our colleagues in Westminster will fight to have them reversed, fighting not just for a fairer Scotland, but for a fairer United Kingdom, as the problems are ideological, not geographical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Mark MacDonald, after which we'll move to the closing speeches.
Thank you very much, Presiding
please.
Officer. And if I can start by declaring an interest, as my family are recipients of child benefit. I want to touch on a few issues that have been brought up during the course of the debate today. This accusation that the Scottish Government is, quote, doing nothing. I think my colleague Jamie Hepburn dealt very well in looking at the policy areas where the Government has taken action. But further to that, in terms of taking action to ameliorate the harmful impact of the coalition welfare reforms, the Scottish Welfare Fund, the commitment to plug the council tax benefit gap, the fact that the government is announcing the benefits advice groups, which will funding £5.4 million. I think that demonstrates government commitment. Beyond that, the social wage which comprises the universal benefits that this government is committed to maintaining, absolutely is about helping those in poverty as well as helping wider society and promotion of social cohesion. No, thank you, Ms Bailey. In terms of that point about social cohesion, it is about the normalisation, as was mentioned by my colleagues earlier. It's about the normalisation of the benefit system. So it's not simply seen as something that only poor people have, and also helps to engender respect for that welfare system among those in the middle and upper classes. I'd also like to deal with this notion about the lessons of history and the point that I made to Malcolm Chisholm. You know, in 1997, the Labour Party came to power following Tory government. They then chose to continue to implement benefit cuts that the Tories had planned in their budget rather than choose to reverse them. I would simply say that fool us once, shame on us, fool us twice, I don't think you'll get the opportunity to do so, Mr Chisholm, because hopefully the Scottish people will see through that when it comes to the vote in 2014. In relation to the other argument that was put forward, that somehow this is about, that this party has suddenly realised that it's about social justice and not about national identity, I care deeply for all of the people who live in Scotland, regardless of their nationality. And to try and claim that the independence cause is defined by national identity is frankly absurd. I want a country where people come from all across the world to base themselves and live in a fairer, more prosperous society. So national identity doesn't matter a jot to me. It's about building a better Scotland for all of the people of Scotland, irrespective of their nationality. And to Willie Rennie, I tried to intervene on Willie Rennie, but he's obviously not in the mood for a debate today. I tried to intervene on Willie Rennie to ask him about the issue of budget impacts, because I said to him during the budget debate last week, I said to Willie Rennie, go away and have a look at the impacts of the budget on income groups in society, and then come back and tell us what you found out. And Mr Rennie clearly didn't do his homework. But luckily, luckily, I have it here for him. So let me quote to him from the Institute of Fiscal Studies budget analysis for the 2012-13 budget. The largest average losses as a fraction of net income from the modelled tax and benefit reforms to be introduced in 2012-13 are among those in the bottom half of the income distribution. The lowest income fifth of households will lose about 1.5% of their net income from these reforms on average. Households towards the bottom of the income distribution lose out particularly from the lower benefit rates that arise from using the CPI to uprate them rather than the RPI or the Rossi index, from the time limiting of contributory employment and support allowance to 1 year for those in work-related activity group, and from the cash freezes to child benefit and working tax credit amounts. So let us hear no more from Mr Rennie that the budget being put forward by the Tory, no, you can deal with it in his summing up, being put forward by the Tories and the Lib Dems at Westminster is somehow helping those at the lower end of the income groups. It is absolutely not helping them. It is detrimental to them. And what is it that the Lib Dems have chosen to rebel on in order to say that there is a difference between them and the Conservative Party? Was it on the NHS dismantling? No. Was it on tuition fees of £9,000? No. Was it on benefit destruction? No. It was on boundary changes. Aye, that'll show them. That's the reality of the Liberal Democrats in government, unwilling to stand up on points of principle and far too willing to stand up on points of self-preservation. And in terms of the Tory arguments that have been put forward today, I heard Alec Johnson continually referring to increased borrowing costs. Now, I know as a farmer he's well used to the construction of straw men, but nonetheless, he should even recognise that his own government are now going around telling people that credit ratings aren't the be-all and end-all. They're not all they're cracked up to be, fully in anticipation of the fact that the UK government is currently likely to lose its AAA credit rating in the not-too-distant future, purely as a result of the ruinous economic policies being pursued by the Chancellor that he supports. So he can't come to this chamber and start bandying around the notion of credit ratings and increased borrowing costs when it's his own Chancellor that is putting that very issue at risk. And in terms of the child benefit reforms which are being put forward, frankly, they are a guddle. There is no way of putting it, no other way of putting it. It is the most bizarre way to construct any form of benefit. The fact it doesn't distinguish between single income and double income families, meaning a single parent on £60,000 a year loses their entire child benefit, but a couple on £49,000 each will retain theirs. And then the high income child benefit charge. Rather than simply stop or reduce the payments for parents earning more than £50,000, they will instead claw it back by forcing these people to go through a self-assessment tax return. It's less a child benefit now, it's more a child paperwork-intensive, interest-free mini loan. Frankly, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you very much. Now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Willie Rennie. 6 minutes, please.
You can see Mark MacDonald's affection for the Liberal Democrats has not improved. Well, maybe that taught you a lesson. What Mark MacDonald fails to recognise is that you need to take all the changes over a period. If you look at one budget in isolation, you do not recognise, for instance, the significant cuts to tax for those on low and middle incomes. You've got to look at everything in the round, not in isolation. I'm sure we can all pick isolated statistics to prove our case, but he needs to look at it in a much more considered way. Now, I know more this afternoon about what the SNP don't like. I thought that's what we would get. I didn't think we would really get that many answers about what kind of reform they would like. They've previously promised on numerous occasions further reform, that they want simplification, that they don't think the welfare state should stay the same. But nothing, not one single thing, not one idea came forward from all their members that spoke today. Jane Baxter, I thought, made a very worthy point where she said that the independent debate should not force an absence on policy. She was absolutely right on that, and that is the excuse. Because whenever anybody is challenged from the SNP about the detail, they say, well, that is a future Scotland's choice, failing to recognise that they need to spell out what it would look like. They cannot criticise, then fail to come up with the answers. And Claire Adamson had some fine words, actually quite a good speech, but no substance at all on policy, no ideas. And I can only assume from all the remarks that they are in favour of increasing the welfare budget by £2.5 billion when Scotland is independent. Because not one single member came up with one idea about reform. Actually, I apologise. Annabel Ewing did come up with a suggestion on Trident. And Trident, I don't know how many times Trident has been spent, but I'm sorry to disappoint Annabel Ewing, but Angus Robertson has already grabbed that money for defence. No. Angus Robertson has already grabbed that money for defence. So numerous times this Trident money has been spent, and apparently now it's going to be spent on the welfare state. I look forward to a little bit of consistency. But I think the Welfare Commission will have received a clear message today, a very clear message, that don't change one single thing. Not one single reform to the welfare state in an independent Scotland. So at least they get a clear message that that is from the SNP, that they need to restore the budget by £2.5 billion because they have no suggestions. The Fiscal Commission, I think, have also got a clear message today, very clear message, that forget about fiscal responsibility. Forget about the fact that the welfare budget is increased by 40% in Labour's time in government, that we should not change one single thing. And this, I think, fundamentally undermines the SNP's case for independence, because they cannot both at the same time claim to be fiscally responsible and then not deal with the welfare state. It needs to be dealt with. It's not sustainable. It is not possible to carry on as we are. And for the SNP to continue to claim that no reform is required, to me, lacks credibility. Now, the child benefit changes are not ideal. I recognise that. It's a bit of a crude system to change it. But it actually avoids expensive means testing process. Now, I don't think we can really argue that it should be the top priority for the highest earners in the country, the wealthiest 15%, to be protected. I would think it's reasonable to actually target that group if you're reforming other parts of the welfare state as well. So although it's not ideal, and I prefer not to do it, I think it's needs must as we are reforming the welfare state. And you would think from the SNP benches, and I have to say some from the Labour benches, that all reform is bad, that nothing should ever change. But to me, some of the changes in the welfare state are actually pretty good. We've all got our own examples of people that we've met in our constituents who tell us their story about the welfare system and the changes. We know that. And I met a family not so long ago who were telling me that they would like to work, but they don't think it would pay, that it would be difficult to go out to work. And they've got their interests of their family at heart. And I commend them for that. But they decide, because it's too difficult, because it's not going to be earning enough, that they are going to stay on benefits. The welfare state traps people on benefits who would like to go to work. If you get a situation where you have to wait 5 weeks before you get your benefits back if you don't keep the job that you've sought, and that happens on many occasions, who people fear losing the job that they're going for. It's not financially worth it. And that's why the changes, so that we make work pay, that we cut tax for those on low and middle incomes, that we cap the welfare receipts, the welfare benefits, that in itself encourages people into work. And we must all agree in this chamber that work is what is good for families. We need to encourage people to go to work. It's a good thing. But you would hear from some that work is a bad thing, that we don't want to encourage, that we don't want to incentivise. I think we need to create a welfare state that encourages. And Christine McKelvey, if I can gently say to her saying that we are attacking women, she just needs to look at two things. The maternity entitlements, the improvements to that, have made a significant input and change to women in work, but also the nursery education for 2-year-olds. 40% of the poorest children in England will get 15 hours a week of nursery education. In Scotland, it's only 1%. That, to me, is an example of the coalition committing to make a difference for women and making a difference for society. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Liz Smith. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I have listened extremely carefully to this debate, and I will endeavour to try and pick up the criticisms from around the chamber. But before I take each of these in turn about the child benefit policy, can I just say where I do agree wholeheartedly with the Deputy First Minister and also with Willie Rennie that it is very important to put this debate in context. And that's something that certainly is happening in this Parliament, it's happening in Westminster, and I think it's also very familiar territory for many other countries around the world. And actually it was an interesting point that Kevin Stewart made, although I think perhaps for a slightly different reason. Because we know from what has been said in the welfare debates at Holyrood and from the pretty robust exchanges this afternoon, that the parties have very substantial differences about the policy way forward. But looking at the party statements on welfare policy, there is relative agreement about the starting position, and the Deputy First Minister set out some examples of that. But that starting position is also similar, because we know that the welfare bill is huge. It grew by 45% between 2000 and 2010, that it is likely to grow significantly in the years ahead, and that the debate about what can and, more importantly, about what should be available as universal benefits is only just beginning. Now, Malcolm Chisholm set out very fairly how he sees the Labour Party paying to maintain universal benefits. But I think, obviously, over time, the Labour Party must spell out, in the context of the other universal payments, whether they would indeed cut that. And I think it is incumbent upon the SNP, if they are going to claim, and the commitment made by the Deputy First Minister and some of the speakers this afternoon, that they will maintain these universal benefits, they have to be able to explain, in the context of either this debate or the referendum debate, about how that will be paid for. Now, these are important debates, and they come from very different angles for the different political parties across the chamber. And I think Willie Rennie also made a very good point when he said we cannot have a situation where it pays not to go to work. That is as immoral as some people are trying to argue that our policies are immoral in hammering the poor all the time. Well, quite frankly, I'll come to that in a minute about hammering the poor, because that is simply not true. Now, underlying all of this is the task that is facing the Westminster Government to make substantial savings to significantly reduce the budget deficit that was left by the predecessor. And it is our view, and the view of others, On the question of child benefit, the coalition government has made a decision that, yes, of course.
Mark MacDonald.
I wonder if Liz Smith feels that the benefit system should be used as a means of deficit reduction, and does that not undermine the notion that the benefit system should be constructed on the principles of fairness?
Elizabeth Smith.
I thank the member for his intervention, but there is an economic reality out there. And that economic reality is there not just because of the size and the needs of that welfare budget. It is there because of the budget deficit as well. We all have to accept that. And I think any political party who tries to deny that, quite frankly, is not living in the real world. So I think we do have to make justifiable savings. And it is the coalition government's intention that better off families take their share of that process. A policy which obviously it hopes will raise a significant amount of money, but will also have a redistributive effect that is so important in the context of the overall welfare changes. Now, we have been criticised very strongly this afternoon for the policy that looks at the situation of somebody on £49,000, two parents in that situation would be very different to somebody who's obviously earning 60,000 and lose it. And I think if members look back on the record, that's a point that I raised with concern several months ago. And I think it would be very fair to say that the Westminster government has had the greatest amount of criticism on that very point. But it is because of that Westminster government has ensured that it moves to a situation where some of that will be tapered so that there is no immediate cut-off, as was the original plan. I think they have listened to concerns about that. We've also had a situation where, and I think this was a point that was raised by Drew Smith, that means testing would have to take place if we were going to adjust that system to a much more complex system of much greater administrative calculations. If you were just going to tax on the household basis rather than on the individuals, that was going to lead to very considerable means testing and complications. There have been criticisms about the methodology, about the fact that this has been complex. Yes, of course it has been complex, but I come back again to the fact that this has to be seen in the context of the overall changes that need to take place. And it is about what is happening in other tax changes. It is about the targeting of groups that the coalition government feel can bear the greater burden for that. Now, Deputy Presiding Officer, just to sum up, I do think it is very important that we have this debate because there is something more fundamental behind the philosophy in all of our positions. And I accept what the SNP is saying about the kind of Scotland that we want to live in. That is true. It is a debate about what kind of Scotland we want to live in. All the political parties here must set out how they feel in times of very considerable pressures on welfare, how we will do that. We will all come to very different conclusions. But it is important that that debate takes place in the context of the referendum debate, and we can then ensure that the public has a real choice.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Now call on Jackie Bailey. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been at times a fractious debate, but I think this underlines the seriousness of the issue before us. There is much in the government's motion in relation to child benefit that I can agree with, and it is worth reminding ourselves of the scale of the impact. 90,000 families in Scotland having their benefit income reduced or removed. 200,000 children across the UK plunged into poverty, and that's likely to be as much as 15,000 children in Scotland. And as others have rightly pointed out, these are the government's own figures. Malcolm Chisholm, though, was absolutely right. The SNP is simply wrong to assert that Labour don't believe in universal benefits. We do. We are proud to have introduced the family allowance and child benefit. But the difference is we want to make sure that where they are universal, they are sustainable and they are affordable. Its importance, child benefit's importance, as a universal benefit is widely recognised because it is a benefit for children, because it is a benefit paid predominantly to women. And what we also chose to do was to target those struggling on low incomes by providing tax credits, but even these are being eroded by the Tory Lib Dem coalition. You know, I'm fond of quoting the Prime Minister. He said in the past that the cuts that would occur as a result of the global recession would fall on the broadest shoulders. First, it was the sick and disabled. Well, now it would appear to be women and children as well. And as I said earlier, the attack on women and children is not confined to child benefit. The benefits uprating bill went even further. Now, the Chancellor has said it's the shirkers, the people with their curtains drawn, who are affected by his cut to tax credits and benefits. The language that he uses is frankly disgusting. But he is fundamentally wrong. By not uprating benefits, it's a direct attack on working people, those striving to support their families. And the UK government, contrary to what Willie Rennie said, have also made a real terms cut to statutory maternity pay. Pregnant women, according to the House of Commons Library, when you take all of the benefit changes together, will lose £1,300 during the course of their pregnancy. So when you take all of those changes together, 2/3 of the overall hit will be on women. And I think various speakers have made the point about the disadvantage that will occur as a result. The impact is absolutely clear. Poverty will increase. And Jim Eadie was right, because all of this is happening at the same time as 8,000 of the UK's millionaires will enjoy a tax cut of £107,000 per year. That's not just unfair, it is immoral. So I join with the many members across this chamber on the government benches and on Labour benches in condemning the coalition for their approach to welfare reform. Having said that, I am, however, genuinely disappointed with the SNP position, where backbencher after backbencher glibly falls back on the usual constitutional arguments. Only with independence will everything be okay. There'll be no deficits, no problems. Presiding officer, the sun will always shine each and every day. But you know, the question of child poverty is serious. It is a complete abdication of responsibility for the SNP not to strain every sinew to alleviate the problem now. Not at some point in the distant future, but actually taking action now. And you know, poverty isn't simply about a lack of income. No, thank you. Before coming to the Parliament, I worked in many of the most disadvantaged communities in Glasgow and the west of Scotland. There I saw that poverty was shaped by poor health, poor educational attainment, lack of a job, low self-esteem, people and communities locked into a cycle of despair. There I saw that the way out of poverty was about access to opportunity, was about support to access employment. You do have the power to deal with this. The Joseph Rowntree report, which Drew Smith, Neil Bibby, Jane Baxter all rightly drew attention to, was absolutely clear on this point. And let me quote Tom McInnes, the author of the report. With political debate dominated by the referendum on independence, it's important to point out that issues that are central to tackling poverty, such as health, childcare, schools, housing, fall within the current legislative powers of the Scottish Government. The problems highlighted in this report cannot wait.
I think the member's not taking interventions,
and should be taken now. Let me say, Presiding Officer, I fundamentally believe that the SNP know that they can do something. Let me remind the SNP that under Labour, the percentage of children in absolute poverty in Scotland fell from 28% in 98-99 to 12% in 2005-2006. I'm very proud that this was the highest fall across the United Kingdom, where a Labour government across the United Kingdom lifted 500,000 children out of poverty. So please don't tell me you lack the power. We more than halved child poverty. Where's your ambition? But of course, you can judge the SNP government by its actions, not its rhetoric. Under this SNP government, the housing budget's been cut by £40 million. Under the SNP government, the college budget has been cut by £35 million. Under this SNP government, absolutely not. I think you should listen. Under this SNP government, the health budget has been cut in real terms. 2,500 nurses have been cut from the health service, and now we're seeing trolley waits at A&E. Under this SNP government, there's been no progress in reducing child poverty. The figures have flatlined. And under this SNP government, the average Scottish household has been around £1,200 a year, worse off than the previous year, the government's own figures. And under the SNP government, do you know, they do promise much, presiding officer, but they deliver little, and nowhere is this so well illustrated as by Neil Bibby's comments. The SNP promised 600 hours of nursery provision for each child in 2007. That was welcome. Wasn't delivered by 2011. In fact, if I recall, it was promised 3 times. Now it's put on pause until 2014 or beyond. Presiding officer, will we ever see it? They may talk the talk. In fact, there's a lot of talk in the chamber, presiding officer, but the evidence suggests that they don't walk the walk. Everything that the SNP do is viewed through a constitutional prism. And as their motion demonstrates, even tackling child poverty is put on pause because it effectively, they're telling the poor people of Scotland, wait 4 years and then we'll get round to them. But what happens? What happens if they lose the independence vote? No answer for the children or families currently in poverty. And you know, presiding officer, despite the noise, you know, I regret that despite what SNP members may say, their agenda is based on the politics of identity. That's not socially progressive. We on the Labour benches believe in fairness and social justice. But you know, the fundamental difference between us and the SNP is we do something about it. Presiding officer, whilst the SNP continue to only care about independence, the children of Scotland are left waiting.
Many thanks. I now call on Margaret Burgess to wind up the debate on behalf of the government. Minister, 10 minutes or thereby, until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, presiding officer. I'm not quite sure 10 minutes I will be able to respond to some of the things that have been said, but I will certainly try to cover the major points. The first thing I would say that this debate's been about child benefit, but more importantly for me, and I think Jackie Bailey just paid a disservice to that, it is about child poverty, and child poverty does matter. We are tackling child poverty, and child poverty is a priority for the Scottish Government. And we are doing what we can, and yes, within the powers we have, because I know you don't like us saying that, but we've had the solution. Labour Party have been open and candid today about their solution, and it's sit back and wait till we get a Labour government within the UK. That's what was said earlier on in the debate. So Labour can sit here in the opposition benches with that as the policy. But as far as we're concerned, we're in these benches and we're doing something about it. And I want to say categorically that children matter to me, child poverty matters to me. And Drew Smith alluded earlier on that we only care about children in Scotland. I care about children anywhere in the world in poverty that are disadvantaged. But the only place that we can do something about it and lead the way is here in Scotland. And that's what we are going to do. We've heard in this debate, and I'll get round to Alex later, I'll get round to his comments later, but there is a lot going on here in Scotland, and we are doing what we can within our powers to tackle poverty. We've heard from the Labour Party that how you would deal with it. That is, spend money. We're not spending enough in education, we're not spending enough in child care, we're not spending enough in housing, we're not spending enough in every single thing that's been talked about. But you have come up with no ideas. The Labour Party presiding officer has come up with no ideas. They have not told us where we are spending too much money, because what they're saying, we're in a fixed budget. So basically what you're saying is we're spending too much in things, but you've not told us yet where we're spending too much money. So that's what I want to know. And when that question, I'll wait for that one. I'll come on now talking about budgets. Willie Rennie said earlier on that the SNP would have, what would we do when the SNP, when they've actually got to work in a budget? The SNP are working in a budget here in this Scottish Parliament. We are balancing the budget, and we will do the same when we can have powers to raise our own finances. I'll give way.
Rennie.
Does that mean that she will immediately restore the £2.5 billion to the welfare budget? Immediately?
What I would say to Willie Rennie is at the moment we in Scotland are paying that £2.5 billion into the UK economy. It's not gone yet. You're cutting it. So that's the first thing I would say. So that, and I would also say about £2.5 billion out the economy, and a number of people have mentioned this. It's not just about people on benefits. It's not just about low-income earners. It's not even about the high-income earners. When we take money out of the economy, that goes out the pockets of people spending it in their local shops, local businesses, and that's going to go. They're going to lose that as well out of all our constituencies throughout Scotland. And I see Alec Johnson nodding his head and agreeing with that as being a good idea. Well, I don't think that's a good idea. We'll come round to the tax bit that Alec Johnson's so keen to promote about the number of people taking out tax. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has said, taking that into account, taking the tax measures and the benefits measures, there's still a regressive tax and the lower income groups are losing out more. So what we're doing is getting a bigger gap between the poor and those that are not poor. We're trying to close the gap. All the efforts that we are making are being undermined by what is happening in other measures. And the Joseph Rowntree report on poverty and social inclusion said that we're unlikely to make progress given the damaging welfare reforms. And we can't get away from that, the problem with welfare reform. And yes, we take it in context. Liz Smith has given her view on it. We're given our view that you start with the kind of society that you want to live in, a society that cares about people, a society that looks out for each other, and a society that protects our poorest and vulnerable. And most importantly, puts the children at heart, because children are our future. And that is so... And I regret a bit that the debate has gone the way it has today, because that's what we should be talking about, children in the future. And what I really find difficult to come to terms with, that the figures that have been given today about the numbers of children going into poverty, the additional children that we're going to see in poverty, these are figures from the government, the UK coalition government. They're telling us this is going to happen, and yet they're still going ahead with these measures. So I say to them, how much do you really care about children? If you know they're putting more children into poverty and still ploughing ahead with those measures, and I can't agree with that. I think that's a disgraceful situation to be in. I'll give way.
Elizabeth Smith.
Would the Minister accept that when it comes to the child benefit policy, that those who are most able to afford are the ones who are being targeted, in other words, to play the most of the burden?
I think, to Liz Smith's point, we all know, and I mean, I think even the Tories here would have to agree, and the Liberal Democrats, it is, I think somebody described it as a shambles. It's an absolute pig's breakfast of a piece of legislation. It makes no sense whatsoever, because we've heard, you've talked, Presiding Officer, the Conservatives have talked here today about those with the broadest shoulders. But even the way it's being implemented, those with the broadest shoulders are not carrying the burden, because what is happening, you can have one person earning £60,000 a year, getting nothing, getting no child benefit. You can have a couple, both earning £49,000 a year, which is an income in that household of almost £100,000, and they get the child benefit. So the broadest shoulders are not taking they are not taking it, and that's the point that you're missing out. I would prefer you just said, we got it wrong, and we've tried, because you tried to fix it. David Cameron tried to sort it and made it worse, and I think what they should be saying is, right, we've really got it wrong, but no, you're ploughing ahead, and the Liberals are supporting you on that. But I think it was Mark MacDonald that mentioned the number of things that the Scottish Government is doing and talked about the social wage. And I think also in response to what Jane Baxter was saying about what are we doing for people in welfare reform, what are we doing to help them? Well, we're doing quite a lot, and I think that should be known. We've got the Scottish Welfare Fund we're setting up. That was talked about. The council tax freeze is helping every family in Scotland. We're talking about the Presiding Officer. I talked about the social wage, is about how we as a government are helping people We're mitigating welfare reform. We're mitigating welfare reform in terms of the Scottish Welfare Fund. We've got the Scottish Welfare Fund in terms of the cut of 10% in our council tax. Along with local authorities, we're making that up to ensure that the most vulnerable don't lose out more. That's a mitigation against welfare reform. We've put money into the Chartered Institute of Housing to provide training and information. Well, no, I'm not taking an intervention. I've taken several interventions to other speakers who didn't take interventions.
You had your chance and you blew it. You blew your own chance.
Yes.
Sit down.
Jackie Bailey, when speaking, said, no, I'm not taking an intervention, listen. So I'm going to use the same phrase, I'm not taking an intervention, listen. We're mitigating welfare reform. We're mitigating against welfare reform. We've introduced the social wage, and that is helping every family in Scotland. And I also want to say, we talked about this, and I want to bring this back to the level that we're talking about some of the welfare reform changes. And I want to talk particularly on how it's affecting people in the housing sector. And I think Kevin Stewart said earlier, let's talk about what it's like for people in our constituency. Well, I spoke to somebody this week, not in my constituency, but somebody I knew who had volunteered, had a mental health problem, had volunteered, had got back the confidence to go to work through the volunteering, got a job, a temporary job, got another temporary job, and now her health has gone backwards. But she lost that temporary job, time was up, because she's now going to be subject to the bedroom tax, because her grown-up son has now left the house and she's living in the house, the area where she got all the support, and now she's going to be subject to the bedroom tax. So I would say to Alec Johnson and to his Liberal colleagues, that's what you're doing to people. People who want to work, that is not incentivising them into work, that is actually a disincentive to work. So I would say, think on that. So I just want to finish here, Presiding Officer. I think I'm running out of time.
45 seconds.
What I would say then, and I know it's not going to be liked in the other benches, but I do think we are looking in this government to look at a system that's it's about fairness and it's a mark of a just society. And I believe that as the government does, that in order to fully achieve that, this Parliament has to have control of the powers needed to deliver it. And that, Presiding Officer, only comes with independence.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on child benefit, and it's now time to move to the next item of business, which is decision time, and to which we now come, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that Amendment 5521.1 in the name of Drew Smith, which seeks to amend motion number 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child benefit, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. We will therefore move to a vote, and members should cast their vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5521.1 in the name of Drew Smith is yes 51, no 63, and there were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Before we move to the second question, I would wish to remind members that in relation to the debate on child benefit, if the amendment in the name of Alex Johnston is agreed, the amendment in the name of Willie Rennie will fall. So the second question is that amendment. The second question is, Mr. Lockhead, that amendment 5521.3 in the name of Alex Johnston, which seeks to amend motion number 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child benefit, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. The Parliament will therefore move to vote on this. Members should cast their vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5521.3 in the name of Alex Johnson is yes 16, no 100. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 5521.2 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion number 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child benefit, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. The Parliament will therefore move to a vote on this, and members should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 5521.2 in the name of Willie Rennie is yes 16, no 100. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child benefit be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. The Parliament will therefore move to a vote. Please cast your votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5521 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is yes 65, no 51. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.